genetic entropy and its theological implications. Many scientists believe in God, however some tend not to get involved in the young Earth versus old Earth debate, because there seems to be no way for science to make an absolute distinction between the two. If God wanted to create things instantly, and having it looking mature and well-aged, like he did when creating Adam for instance, he could do that, but science might not be able to investigate it very well. Although, that said, it is intriguing to discover carbon-14 in diamonds, and soft tissues and blood cells preserved in dinosaur bones. On the other hand, if God wanted to take millions of years to create things, that would be easy for him as well, since he is eternal, and perhaps the apparent speed of starlight and the redshift of galaxies suggest that the universe might be 14 billion years old, who knows? There are many more philosophical arguments for and against both views. This is another situation that demonstrates the limits of human beings. We are trying to claw our way out of a vast darkness, and doing it on our own looks futile. Evolutionists often try to make their belief out to be a legitimate theory by lumping it together with successful theories, like relativity theory and quantum mechanics and so forth. But it is not hard to see how invalid that argument actually is, because a proper scientific theory has to make successful predictions at its most fundamentally computational level. The problem with equivocating relativity theory and quantum mechanics with macroevolutionary hypotheses is, at their most fundamental level, they just do not equivocate, they are not even close to being computationally equivalent. Macroevolution was supposed to be an explanation for the origin of all species. While relativity theory and quantum mechanics fundamentally compute and successfully predict that which we can observe and measure in operational terms, macroevolutionary theory fails to do so, and instead, the opposite of its most major prediction is what is actually observed operationally. This should not have surprised anyone, when information theory and the second law of thermodynamics with its statistical explanation is not taken into consideration. And when a hypothesis rests on another hypothesis, the likelihood of it being wrong goes up exponentially. Darwin's hypothetical tree of life relies on not only the macroevolution hypothesis being true, but it also relies on the mutationist dogma, the dogma of functional complexity somehow naturally increasing, the belief that the natural evolutionary processes in biology can replace God, replace intelligent design, as the explanation for it all. But, test and observations, along with fundamentally calculating outcomes, demonstrates the process of natural selection of genetic mutations to be only degenerative, insidiously destructive, over successive generations, and over time, so it appears that it's not going to give you a Darwinian tree of life at all, but instead we can compute, from it, that which is observed. A process of increasing genetic entropy, and, more specifically relevant to this discussion, genomic decay, which is more noticeable in smaller, isolated, more inbred populations, which is not what the Darwinists were hoping to see. The evolutionists' only reasons for not allowing intelligent design in the door of the science room are ad hominem, not scientific. Otherwise, in order to be consistent, we would have to cancel all types of forensic evidence, and proclaim those areas of science no longer legitimate, which would be absurd. Ironically, in today's world of cancel culture, the only reason that macroevolutionary ideas have not been cancelled, despite their dismal failure to predict much of anything definitive or useful, is because of an entrenched, materialist, ideological, naturalistic, fanatical, religious fervor within the evolutionist community to keep it alive, somewhat akin to flogging a dead horse. Such is the Darwinist cult. Macroevolution is the great modern-day superstition that is perpetuated on the basis of prejudices and feelings, rather than operational science. That is, it does not rest on reproducible experimental results, which is what the evolutionists deliberately ignore. No matter how many repeatable experiments demonstrate this macroevolutionary idea as being wrong, their ad hoc favored escape, that they try and use to rescue their hypothesis from getting debunked, is that of appealing to vast amounts of unobservable time. This is what we typically see from the evolutionist community, even though physicists have clearly shown, both mathematically and experimentally, that time is only a destructive phenomenon. Things age, stuff deteriorates. Their cognitive dissidence of this fundamental truth is astounding. That said, it is encouraging to see some physicists giving some attention to the past hypothesis, which is the backward extrapolation based on repeatable observations, a mathematical retrodiction, that the universe began its existence in a state of lowest entropy. In other words, its initial conditions were more organized. It had to have been incredibly specified to a degree that might exceed all computation, a scientific conclusion for which there is no scientific explanation. One particular notable theoretical physicist, Sir Roger Penrose, calculated its unlikelihood, based on certain theoretical prerequisites, to be 1 in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123. If the denominator were written out as a singular number, it would consist of more knots than perhaps the amount of fundamental particles in the observable universe, let alone the combinatorial possibility space that this number is attempting to describe, in order to estimate the theoretical improbability of the initial conditions of the universe. That would have been necessary for it to now be in its observed current state. Humans are prone to superstition. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Since back in times long ago, when people heard the bushes rustling, they thought it might have been a predator, ready to pounce on them, so such fear helped a person to stay alive longer. Unfortunately, some superstitions can lead one down the wrong path, when it is not only a fear of the unknown, but becomes a belief in something that is false. For instance, perhaps for most of human history, some people superstitiously thought that maggots could spontaneously arise from rotten meat. In more recent times, there are still people who want to believe that life can emerge from non-life, somehow only from random natural chemical processes, and they call that piece of fanciful imagination abiogenesis, despite the fact, science has established that the simplest self-replicating cell is not simple at all, but sophisticated at a level currently beyond scientific comprehensibility. Then there have also been those who want to believe in the more popular modern-day superstition known as macroevolution, deliberately ignoring the truth that science continually reveals natural evolution to only be a destructive process in this regard, that is, a process of increasing entropy, not a creative one at all. So the idea is unscientific and anti-scientific. Okay, yes, it may be popular, but the desire for popularity clouds a person's objectivity, and encourages one to be intellectually lazy, and of weak character, so such a desire for pure acceptance should not supersede our quest for truth. Yet some people still want to call it a legitimate theory. But, technically, it is a religion, actually a cult, known as Darwinism. One of the ways that this becomes obvious is when such people get upset at anyone who criticizes it scientifically, and who logically reveals its falsehood. What makes it worse is that this logically absurd belief system is involuntarily funded by the taxpayers of some countries. Why do some people still want to believe it? Atheists believe it because it provides them with an illusory confirmation bias, cherished by those humanists who want to imagine that they are not answerable to the laws of a transcendent intelligent creator, and such reasoning is emotional, ad hominem. But macroevolution has been scientifically falsified by all the distinguishing experiments and observations. Let's talk about humanism, whatever that means. Presumably, those who like to imagine that they are not answerable to a higher intelligent creative power, and that their idea of morality somehow has a solid foundation. It may seem like it has some short-term advantages, but it is ultimately destined to fail, like those rare, so-called beneficial mutations that evolutionists appeal to. But let's ignore the available data, and imagine, for argument's sake, that the atheist Professor Richard Dawkins' hypothesis was somehow correct. Let's presuppose hypothetically that God doesn't exist, and therefore the universe, at bottom there is no good, no evil, nothing but blind pitiless indifference. Well, if that is true, we may as well just enjoy, as best we can, the brief futile time we have left, before our previous non-existence resumes forevermore, and it will be as though none of us were ever here. All our friends, all our loved ones, came into this world ultimately for nothing. All your plans, all your aspirations were pointless. All the politics, all the debates about the environment, all the worry about human extinction, all of it utterly futile. The universe will succumb to heat death, and it will have all been utterly pointless. And indeed, why would we even be talking about this right now? Why bother with this conversation at all? What difference does it make? Other than some short-term amusement perhaps, other than some shallow narcissistic attention-seeking or adulation from friends, or perhaps revenue-raising, it's ultimately futile. No loving God, no eternal future hope, and even if we don't like the idea, that in itself doesn't prove such imagined futility wrong. And perhaps you've gained some sort of tenuous friendship with the world. Congratulations! And if we don't take the question of God's existence seriously, and Dawkins does take it seriously by the way, well that's what he says anyway, at least he frames the argument very well, can we ignore the implications? A short and pointless existence, whether enjoyable or not, is all we have to look forward to, isn't it? And beyond that, no further purpose for us, other than what is transitory, ephemeral, temporary. Enjoy it, if you can, while it lasts, it'll go very quickly. And consequently, hypothetically speaking, if you can get away with doing something injurious and hurtful to somebody, for your short-term advantage, perhaps cheat them out of their life savings, or murder them for their wealth, why wouldn't you? And why shouldn't you? And how do you justify the word ought in moral statements? When it comes to any potential act of impunity, there is no logical imperative for you in such a worldview to behave either one way or another, when with the absence of dire consequences. Perhaps engage in some ethnic cleansing, and perpetrate genocide. For you, it's just survival of the fittest, according to the axioms of that worldview, you ought to do it, so you can pass on your genes to the next generation, so why should anyone trust you or feel safe with you in their neighborhood? Where is such credibility to be found? I just don't see it. This in no way means that atheists don't choose to be good people, but on what basis are they doing that? Of course, when it comes to proving God's existence, I have failed you in this respect. I have proven nothing, when only using such philosophical reasoning, and not appealing to the available data. Okay, other than maybe lessening the likelihood of you harming somebody, noble perhaps, we still need to do better than that when questioning God's existence. All I have done is ask you to believe it, anyway. If he doesn't exist, then he doesn't exist, no matter what I say about it, and alternatively, if he does exist, then he does exist, so we need to do better than that. We need scientific proof, not philosophical pontification. So once again the entropy problem is the only physical, scientific distinction in all of this. And perhaps biblical archaeology might make a cumulative case as well. Science, physics, has demonstrated that everything logically began more organized, and it amuses me how little attention materialist atheists give it. It seems there is an apparent lack of intellectually honest investigation here, with this particular experimentally repeatable truth. It's the real devastating blow to the macroevolution hypothesis that they continually skip over. Do such people want to get closer to the truth? Well, if they are not willing to thoroughly address this particular physical truth, the second law of thermodynamics, and this most fundamental of scientific questions, why all things began more ordered, then not as far as I can see. Seemingly, truth might not look like part of their agenda. It might appear that something else is motivating their proclamations. What it is, it may be hard to say. But if human history is anything to go by, then I am afraid to say it. Therefore I maintain that without God, we are doomed, which is self-evident and irrefutable, scientifically so. As for those who want to relegate the biblical Garden of Eden or the Genesis flood to only myth and legend, well, okay. But I might ask, do you honestly believe that any soft tissue from dinosaurs can remain in the physical world after 65 million years? Am I allowed to be skeptical of that? Or, when asking the evolutionists that question, will they just get annoyed by it and toss their usual favorite buzzwords at me, such as personal incredulity, and so forth? Isn't it more rational to look at both secular and creationist websites so that you get both perspectives, not just confirmation bias? So, I challenge you to be brutally honest with yourself. Do look up soft tissue and dinosaur bones, for the sake of being informed about the facts, perhaps on the web. Get both sides of the argument. I dare you to see it from both perspectives. Be unbiased. Don't trust only one narrative. Alternatively, what if we were to go along with the more traditional worldview of an intelligent creator? What if we were to live according to, say, the biblical standard? Would that be a wise way to live? Would society benefit from it? For instance, What about the advice found in the biblical book of Proverbs chapter 1? What of its claims? Are they philosophically reasonable? Are they as wise as they claim to be? Here is the narrative, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, to learn wisdom and discipline, to understand wise sayings, to acquire the discipline that gives insight, righteousness, good judgment, and uprightness, to impart shrewdness to the inexperienced, to give a young man knowledge and thinking ability. A wise person listens and takes in more instruction, a man of understanding acquires skillful direction. To understand a proverb and a puzzling saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of Jehovah is the beginning of knowledge. Only fools despise wisdom and discipline. Listen, my son, to the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother. They are an attractive wreath for your head and a fine ornament for your neck. My son, if sinners try to entice you, do not consent. If they say, "Come with us. Let us set an ambush to shed blood. We will lie hidden, waiting for innocent victims without cause. We will swallow them alive as the grave does, whole, like those going down to the pit. Let us seize all their precious treasures, we will fill our houses with spoil. You should join us, and we will all share equally what we steal. My son, do not follow them. Keep your feet off their path, for their feet run to do evil, they hurry to shed blood. It is surely in vain to spread a net in full sight of a bird. That is why these lie in ambush to shed blood, they lie hidden to take the lives of others. These are the ways of those seeking dishonest profit, which will take away the life of those who obtain it. True wisdom cries aloud in the street. It keeps raising its voice in the public squares. At the corner of the busy streets it calls out. At the entrances of the city gates it says, "How long will you inexperienced ones love inexperience? How long will you ridiculers take pleasure in ridicule? And how long will you foolish ones hate knowledge? Respond to my reproof. Then I will pour out my spirit for you, I will make my words known to you. Because I called out, but you kept refusing, I stretched out my hand, but no one was paying attention, you kept neglecting all my advice and rejecting my reproof, I also will laugh when disaster strikes you. I will mock when what you dread comes, when what you dread comes like a storm, and your disaster arrives like a storm wind, when distress and trouble come upon you. At that time they will keep calling me, but I will not answer, they will eagerly look for me, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge, and they did not choose to fear Jehovah. They refused my advice, they disrespected all my reproof. So they will bear the consequences of their way, and they will be glutted with their own counsel. For the waywardness of the inexperienced will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But the one listening to me will dwell in security, and be undisturbed by the dread of calamity." End of chapter 1. Well, what did you make of that? So perhaps such a worldview would benefit society. But what are the logical problems that might come with it? The ancient Greek philosopher, Epicurus, presented a well-known logical problem in his own way, the problem of evil, a paradox that has plagued people of deep thinking ability for probably longer than we might imagine. This so-called Epicurean paradox says, if God is willing to prevent evil but is not able to, then he is not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but is not willing to, then he is not all good. If he is both willing and able to prevent evil, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? So this seeming paradox assumes upfront only two simple possibilities, but as many theoreticians know, a paradox generally means that we have missed something in our argument. The problem itself may have been framed too simply after all. Some feel that this paradox might be resolved by the assumption that such a God doesn't exist, but there are scientific reasons that seem to suggest that an intelligent designer of nature exists, and if that is true, then one partial answer to this problem might be to suggest that God allows evil and suffering in the world because perhaps he wants us to have free will, and evil and suffering are sometimes the inevitable consequences of that. But some might reason that if God is all-powerful, then he should be able to prevent evil without interfering with our free will, so if that were true then it wouldn't completely solve the problem. Well then, perhaps that is not true, and therefore just because God is able to prevent suffering, should he always? Now, that's an entirely different question, a question that this paradox excluded from its scope of inquiry. Should we be shielded from the consequences of bad behavior? Maybe not. That may be all well and good perhaps, but what about the innocent, who unjustly suffer the consequences of other people's bad behavior? How do you choose to define good and bad? What is your standard, and by what premise do you base it upon? So once again we are asking a somewhat different question, even further outside the scope of the prerequisites within the Epicurean paradox. So where would we find a possible response to that? Well, those people who believe that the Epicurean paradox is a compelling argument against the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God, may need to consider those other factors. For instance, is your definition of all-good and all-powerful necessarily correct? By what axiomatic standard are you implementing your judgment, what seems like your free will, of the situation at hand? Who has the right to decide what is good and what is bad? If there is no objective morality, if there is not any moral standards by which we can all agree upon, then how can this problem ever be solved only by humans? If Epicurus had known of the biblical account in Genesis about original sin, and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad with its forbidden fruit, properly acknowledged the issue of universal sovereignty contested by Satan against God, would he still have regarded it a paradox? It may be hard to say. So, perhaps, God is willing and able to prevent evil, and is going to, but has chosen not to do it yet, for some greater, long-term reason, maybe a reason that might be beyond our own very limited and short-term interests. And so the question today is still asked. Why are so many people, today, non-religious, not religious in the traditional sense? Is it due to the theory of evolution, or is it perhaps the problem of evil in the world? No one, alive on earth today, has ever seen God, literally, nor have we yet seen any sort of miraculous divine intervention, in the modern world. So it is certainly a good question that is deserving of our serious consideration, because whatever answer you can imagine, it logically has profound implications for us all. When contemplating the mystery of existence, the fact that physical things exist despite the relentlessness of entropy, and even when trying to come up with an ultimate explanation for the existence of life, there is every good scientific mathematical reason, based on our unerringly consistent and repeatable experience of natural processes and mathematical laws, to plausibly believe, without significant doubt, with very negligible remaining skepticism, that each successive generation of any organisms is not only overwhelmingly unlikely as good as the generation before it, but far more likely to be even more degenerated than the one before, so that things are not evolving upwardly, uphill, but that they are instead devolving, that is, ultimately going down, significantly less and less, in their amount of organized complexity and functionality, essentially increasingly junk. We know that organisms, in general, contain definite amounts of irreducible functionality, therefore we have good reason to believe, from degenerative processes that have been observed, that only a limited amount of genetic information can possibly mutate into only more junk, before life functions cease. Anyone believing the opposite of this scientifically measured phenomenon, or believing any ideas opposite to what is repeatedly, without exception, observed by scientists, is manifestly superstitious. So let's discuss this modern-day superstition, often referred to as macroevolution. Any genuine scientist, familiar with the immutable laws of nature and especially the mathematical principles underpinning the second law of thermodynamics, would never accommodate such folly and superstition trying to infiltrate its way into the science room. Even all people in general, including genuine scientists, recognize that things decay, and that, ultimately, all processes of nature are downward, and in some sense irreversible, especially near the atomic level. All the atoms of something never reorganize themselves back to a previous state, let alone a more organized state, but to the contrary, they deteriorate. The evolutionists' only retort, if you can believe there is one at all, is to suggest that well-understood scientific principles are somehow being misapplied, but this objection, to these thoroughly demonstrated facts, is just superstitious nonsense, and it's a dishonor to the scientific profession. In nature, the larger the combinatorial configurational possibility space is, the more likely the one-way direction of change is toward uniformity, homogeneity, equilibrium. This is dramatically demonstrated by how gases and liquids always behave. The trillions of atoms, or molecules, bouncing around, always equalize the total mass of what they are part of, to the lowest state of potential energy and inevitability, the very highest, overwhelming, probability. And that is why heat flows toward cold, and high pressure toward low pressure, and it never spontaneously reverses. When it comes to the evolutionary processes happening in biology, and even its origin, materialists want to believe that the opposite is possible. This naive idea that nature would only select the incredibly unlikely and not the likely is grossly mistaken. Nature more often selects the probable. Why? Because it is simply there to select, and the highly improbable is virtually never there. By definition, the more entropic state is overwhelmingly probable. The second law of thermodynamics says that the ubiquitous direction of change in the universe is toward higher probability, and that is what everyone sees. There is no discovered logical reason to think it any different for the possible arrangements of base pairs. In DNA, the written code, scientists don't even have a good theory about how the DNA molecule could form naturally without biological mechanisms already existing, let alone the embedded code. In naturalistic terms, non-functional, non-coded possibilities vastly outnumber the existing, functional, coded possibilities within that particular combinatorial possibility space. For minimal, irreducibly functional, self-replicating, first life to only naturally emerge from randomness appears logically impossible. There is every logical reason that language, digital code, genetic code embedded on the DNA molecule, or any other type of symbolic code, can only be generated by a mind. Intelligent design is currently the only known, and therefore, plausible, explanation for the creation of coded language, even if the existence of the designer might be unexplainable, even if this offends our sense of logic, or if any personal ambitions of finding an ultimately complete computational logical pathway are thwarted. We can speculate about another possible cause, maybe even an experimentally reproducible naturalistic explanation, but science has not found it. The hallmarks of design, and the theological implications, are clear. But any possible transcendent causality, anything that might exist outside of the known natural laws, might possibly be beyond the natural sciences, and the ability of the human mind to completely comprehend. Is there any way of knowing whether such an ultimate investigation would not be fruitless? Perhaps. But this question in itself doesn't negate the possible existence of the intelligent designer, of which the natural evidence seems to indicate is highly probable, so it's a separate question. The evolutionists, like everyone else, see the minor differences and changes within a species, within various species, and, unlike other people, they extrapolate via the assumption that such differences can gradually change enough in a way that might provide an exclusively naturalistic explanation for the origin of all species of life, which is the idea often called macroevolution, something that they readily acknowledge cannot really be distinguished within a human lifetime going in an uphill direction of change toward greater complexity. So the creationists, however, extrapolate the diametric opposite of this hypothesis. They, instead, look at the observable aging processes in the cells of humans and other life forms, actually experimentally and observably distinguishable downhill processes happening right now for all to see, along with all the known deleterious germline mutations, very observable processes happening right now. And so they reason that genomes over generations are de-evolving, aging, degenerating. While this genetic entropy argument is based at the fundamental level, the evolutionists still try to debunk it by using mere heuristic reasonings, which looks rather unsatisfactory, instead of the more fundamental statistical aspects of it that the creationists take seriously, and, very important for scientific inquiry, the creationists' method of extrapolation is in agreement with working experiments and their observations, and basically in agreement with what we all experience in everyday life. You have to wonder, why would things be any different over vast timescales, even where natural selection is involved? Could a minuscule subset of the total genetic mutations perhaps, on very rare occasions, by chance, somehow end up being a more functional complex integration than what they were before they were imperfectly replicated, as many evolutionists have, historically, believed? And when did this type of question start to become more important for the historical sciences? So this debate, between, in principle polar opposites, materialist evolutionists and intelligent designists, and perhaps, principally between atheists and theists, is raging today. American poet Delmore Schwartz once said, "Time is the school in which we learn, time is the fire in which we burn." December 8, 1913 to July 11, 1966. Modern genetics has been revealing the greater and greater significance of that statement. Time is indeed the fire in which we burn, and the arrow of time goes in one direction only. And even average folk are all conscious of the fact that we die. Matu Kimura, November 13, 1924 to November 13, 1994, was a Japanese biologist who postulated the neutral theory of molecular evolution. The theory posited that fundamentally most mutations are neutral and not naturally selected. It did allow for the possibility that most mutations are deleterious. This theory immediately became controversial. While it received much support from many molecular biologists, it also attracted opposition from many evolutionary biologists because the first principles, the axioms, of their hypotheses were in effect being inadvertently challenged by this newer idea. Probably the main reason for this controversy is because atheists of modern times, in order to find some kind of intellectual fulfillment, have clung to the belief that time is the hero of the plot in the evolution of life, despite experimental evidence and mathematical evidence of the contrary. It has been imagined, dreamed up, and asserted upon the public, the idea that, given enough time, instead of things only aging and degrading, any highly improbable thing might sometimes happen, where natural selection is involved, namely, life from non-life. An upward, uphill, progressive evolution, to greater levels of complexity. And this naturalistic superstition has been abusively dogmatically inflicted upon the minds of young school children, in their supposedly, so-called, science classroom, perhaps counteracting any possible belief they may have had in the existence of an intelligent creator of the world, thus causing some of them to progressively spiral into a hopeless nihilistic abyss of depression. It is no surprise that any evidence that threatens to debunk such an entrenched materialist ideology, no matter how overwhelmingly this refutation against Darwinism is supported by sound logic and empirical repeatable experimental evidence, nonetheless will be emotionally and desperately fought against by atheists. The real question that is rarely addressed is whether upward mindless evolution from natural selection is either highly improbable or logically impossible. We don't know. But here is what we do know: time has so far only ever been observed to be the enemy of any vaguely imagined, hypothetical upward biological process somehow being able to exist in nature. Time is the destructive enemy of complexity. Regardless of any type of variation within species, or genetic drift, any remixing of the existing genetic information within a population, even if some genetic traits are naturally favored over others, it won't prevent harmful mutations from accumulating. Such ideas of natural upward change appear to be unsubstantiated myths. Where the direction of change is distinguishable, downward processes, entropic processes, even when natural selection is involved, are all that scientists have ever observed. So facts are facts. They're not affected by how we feel about them, no matter how inconvenient, despite what any of our pet theories of the universe happen to be. The facts are what they are, whether we like them or not. For example, the observable and testable principle of irreducible complexity threatens to overthrow the belief in blind, upward evolution. To blatantly dismiss such observable, testable, scientifically established, irreducible phenomena is irrational. However, there is a far more ubiquitous principle of our universe, the mathematically proven entropy principle that seems to be unassailable. The fact that entropy increases in everything, when left to nature, is empirically justified. This fundamental statistical law of nature seems to be a barrier to any sort of hypothesized unguided naturalistic upward evolution, perhaps the wishful thinking of materialist atheists, including that belief of what many refer to as macroevolution, and proven imagined naturally caused large-scale changes of increasing functional complexity over many generations, and also another obscure unsubstantiated idea called abiogenesis, spontaneous generation of life from non-life. Time is the enemy of complexity. The arrow of time, the one-way direction of time, is defined by increasing decay, degeneration, which is a well-understood principle in physics. If there are principal phenomena within our universe that are truly irreducible, then, even with infinite time, and infinite combinatorial possibility space, these phenomena arising from chance occurrences would seem to be an absolute impossibility. This is a principal reason why atheists who desperately do not want to allow a divine foot into their worldview, desperately want to try and debunk the well-known biologist, Michael Behe, with his argument of irreducible complexity in biological systems, where already such systems have been proven to have vast areas of irreducible functionality. There are so many examples in biology where the required irreducible amount of specific parts need to be there, and very specifically arranged, for those functions to be possible. Such willful ignorance of these phenomena is inexcusable for a scientist. Looking at this whole problem, the materialists' macroevolution hypothesis, from a physics perspective, and even possibly more problematic the abiogenesis idea, there are apparent impossibilities within such ideas. It appears insurmountable. With the badly thought out abiogenesis idea, there is empirically a gaping chasm of non-replication between minimal life and non-life. There is not any continuum at all. Even minimal life is vastly complicated so as to baffle the scientific mind, and there are no self-replicators below the level of minimal life, contrary to the fanciful imaginations imposed upon the public by some prominent evolutionists. Science has revealed such imagined continuity to be mythology. When trying to create complex functional biological systems, especially with the creation of minimal self-replicating life, a simple random shake of the atoms will not arrange them into something functional, especially when it comes to the sophisticated irreducible functionality of a cell, minimal, self-replicating, life. Nor has anyone provided a sufficient explanation of how a random gradualistic process will be able to do the job, even if at the vastly more complex DNA code level subjected to natural selection, let alone at the prebiotic chemical level, because in such cases there are googleplexes of orders of magnitude more ways for something to be wrong than there are for something to go right. The very principle of entropy, and the role it plays within the second law of thermodynamics, a fact that atheists irrationally insist on ignoring. The amount of wrong, non-functional, ways something like this can be, are vastly many more times the number of fundamental particles in the known universe. Therefore, the right way for it to be, will virtually never happen naturally. For irreducibly complex functions to form, a hypothesized evolutionary difficulty is even nastier, statistically vastly many times worse again, as if it wasn't devastating enough to the theory already, because you need many things to go right all at once, in order to reach any irreducible function, and that just can't happen naturally. And since the right way is only one small part among many on the way toward the many codependent irreducible functionalities found in biology, those functionalities look not only improbable but actually impossible, if only coming from non-intelligent natural processes, and, even worse yet again, they are all subject to decay. We are not only dealing with impossibilities here, but hierarchies of impossibilities. These salient mathematical scientific facts are why the entropy principle makes irreducibly complex biological functions impossible from only undirected naturalistic processes. But, despite all of that, ideologically committed militant atheists are determined to always try to debunk the irreducible complexity argument. One might imagine them claiming to do it for scientific rigor, despite the obvious truthful logic of these scientifically testable irreducible phenomena. It's a clash of ideologies, not objective science from the exclusionary naturalists, and this reveals that such materialist atheists are astoundingly superstitious in this regard, but the facts of these statistical impossibilities are indifferent to such irrational unreasonableness. Call this whole argument a God of the gaps, or an exclusionary naturalism of the gaps. Call it whatever you feel you must, and say about it what you will. Nonetheless, if intellectually honest, we have to acknowledge the cold hard fact that the origin of these irreducibly functional phenomena appears beyond the reach of science, and they seem to necessitate miracles. It looks like there is no getting around it. In the science room, miracles of the gaps may be all that you are left with, for these multitudinous examples of irreducible phenomena in biology, rendering science insufficient. We have to deal with it. This is yet another of many ways in which the limits of science are becoming manifest. In the search for truth, Which of the following viewpoint options do you think is the most objective one for a scientist? 1. The idea comes from a creationist and therefore I reject it. 2. The idea comes from an evolutionist and therefore I reject it. 3. Where the idea came from is irrelevant. Show me the evidence, not just confirmation bias for either idea, but something definitive, something experimentally testable, repeatable, and unfalsified, something that distinguishes the irrefutable truth within one idea and is in disagreement with the other. If you are coming from a scientific perspective, then hopefully you chose the third option. But whatever you choose, bear in mind, arguments by exclusion are typically indicative of a flawed ideology. If you can neither prove nor disprove an idea, then whether you choose to believe it or disbelieve it, one way or the other, it is faith. For a scientist, belief or disbelief should wait for the evidence. Ad hominem attacks against either evolutionists or creationists are unscientifically irrelevant, irrational, and superfluous, whereas science is based on applicable physical evidence, experimental and repeatable, using logic and sound reasoning. In order to challenge our beliefs, whatever they are in our modern secular world, we must at least acknowledge that there seem to only be two basic choices here: either the past eternal, uncreated, creator, prime mover, is an ensemble of blind natural processes, or there is an intelligent designer or designers. Likely your leap of faith is either in nature, as the ultimate creator, or in God. This is the leap of faith, in either direction, which some people refuse to take. It is uncomfortable for at least two possible reasons. One reason, that creationists might find unsettling, is, what some have speculated, that it might prove our existence to be pointless and meaningless, and the second alternative reason, that perhaps atheists dislike, is, an idea that might be emotionally unsettling for them, that the entropy law is a strong argument for a more organized beginning to everything, which logically implies the existence of God, to whom one would then be accountable for their behavior. Either way you cut it, emotions have gotten in the way of logic and sound reasoning. Put your emotions aside, if you can, and consider the science. If, indeed, there is an intelligent creator, what role, then, do the observable forms of natural evolution play in reality? All things decay, they don't reverse. They never get better, they only get worse. Do not ignore the law of decay. The entropy law is only one way. And so ever since, we have not been winning. But entropy hints at an organized beginning. And through all the mess, our feet have shod. I think that perhaps there is a God. Well then, this might all seem rather philosophical, but let's go with that idea anyway and see where it might logically lead us. In the Bible book of Revelation, chapter 4 and verse 11, the Apostle Paul wrote, "You are worthy, Jehovah our God, to receive the glory and the honor and the power, because you created all things, and because of your will, they came into existence and were created." So obviously that's the biblical perspective, and there is a certain amount of skepticism that one is inclined to have. Let's assume that what might seem like contradictions, or paradoxes, are actually not. Can this be tested? If we go along with the idea that the Bible is inspired of God, letting Scripture interpret Scripture, what are some of the implications that would emerge? Can we whittle away any misinterpretations? Well, another, emotional, reason that gets in the way of logical thinking, is what many atheists have pointed out, the hellfire doctrine. And they make a very good point about it. It is ludicrously logically absurd that God would have you tortured in a burning fire for all eternity for some wrong that you had committed for only a limited, finite amount of time. But, what many people don't realize, that when basing our reasoning on the premise of the internal self-consistency of biblical canon, the Bible itself also clearly refutes this hellfire doctrine. It clearly tells us that the soul is not immortal, even though so many of Christendom's denominations have so irresponsibly and reprehensibly claimed that it is. There seems to be an even deeper level of evil behind this unscriptural teaching, perhaps a disingenuous way of controlling people by creating, in them, a superstitious fear. It dishonors the name of God, of whom the Bible consistently describes as being, not only, a God of justice, but where appropriate, also, a God of mercy and forgiveness, whose name, when translated from the ancient biblical texts into modern English, is Jehovah. So how does God really feel about burning people alive? Well, the Bible tells us how God felt about the ancient Canaanite nations that existed in pre-Christian times, who sacrificed babies and young children to their false gods by burning them alive in the fire, a fact confirmed true by archaeological science. This is a level of ubiquitous cultural depravity existing back in past times that many of us living in modern times might find difficult to believe. Those scriptural accounts tell us that Almighty God Jehovah was so offended by the level of depravity that this culture had reached, that he used the nation of Israel to eradicate that culture off the face of the earth, and some might wonder why he didn't do it sooner than when he did. But, whatever your opinion about it might be, the point in all of this is obvious. God did not want someone to be burned alive, even for a short period of time, let alone for all eternity. The Bible teaches that the soul can die. The soul is not immortal, therefore logically there cannot be such a hellfire existing either. Unfortunately, it has to be said that it is disappointing that many creationists still cling to this ridiculous, God-dishonoring, unscriptural belief. So why do so many of the world's religions teach immortality of the soul? Some psychologists postulate this tendency to be the result of the inherent inability of the human mind to accept the idea of death. Some theologians point to a scripture in the Bible, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11, where it says that God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has even put eternity in their heart, yet mankind will never find out the work that the true God has made from start to finish. So you can go even further into this and logically ask, why did Jesus call the devil the father of the lie? According to the Bible, Satan the devil told the first, original, lie to Eve in the Garden of Eden. In fact, in the book of Revelation, it calls him the original serpent. In the book of Genesis, the serpent told Eve that if she ate from the forbidden fruit, she would not die, but would become like God, knowing good and bad. Well, that was a very cunning half-truth. In some sense, she certainly got to know good and bad, but contrary to what that serpentine avatar of Satan told her, she died. This half-truth that Satan told Eve was the ultimate bait-and-switch ever perpetrated on humanity. That blatant lie has since been perpetuated, this common fallacy that human consciousness, or some part of the human soul, can somehow survive death, and is somehow immortal. This is the original, satanic, lie, upon which the hellfire myth is contingent. So if the notion of immortal souls is mythology, then the much-touted hellfire doctrine cannot be a possibility. The Bible speaks about a future resurrection of humans to a renewed future earth, during a 1,000-year reign of Christ, so if souls are clearly not immortal, then it makes logical sense why there is a need for a miraculous divine resurrection of those who have fallen asleep in death. The scriptures speak of a relatively small limited number of people also being resurrected to heaven, to rule as kings and priests over humankind, with Christ during his 1,000-year reign, a time when the human race will be restored back to perfection. Humans will have been freed from the slavery of decay, and after this has been accomplished, Jesus will hand the kingdom back to his God and Father Jehovah. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 28 says, "But when all things will have been subjected to him, then the Son himself will also subject himself to the one who subjected all things to him, that God may be all things to everyone." And in chapter 15 verse 32 Paul stated, "If the dead are not to be raised up, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we are to die." Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 4, God says, "Look, all the souls, to me they belong. As the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son, to me they belong. The soul who sins is the one who will die." Logically, the soul can, and does, die, as what is plainly stated in the Bible. Thus when the Bible talks about fire and torment, or the lake of fire, or a rubbish dump outside the walls of Jerusalem called Gehenna, where the bodies of dead criminals were often disposed of and burnt, these things are not referring to some hellfire, a fallacy that empirically disagrees with other parts of the biblical canon. And when certain Bible translations wrongly translate Gehenna as the word hell, and when the Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word Hades are translated as hell instead of the grave, then good Bible scholars are aware of these blatant inaccuracies. And so the Bible, at Ecclesiastes chapter 9, in verse 5 and 6, says that the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing at all. Also, their love and their hate and their jealousy have already perished, and they no longer have any share in what is done under the sun. And in verse 10 we read, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do with all your might, for there is no work nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom in the grave, where you are going." But, according to biblical canon, all is not lost, as Acts chapter 24 verse 15 informs us of the future hope. It says that there is going to be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. In John chapter 5 verse 28, Jesus said, "Do not be amazed at this, for the hour is coming in which all those in the memorial tombs will hear his voice and come out." Logically, if we accept Bible canon as our axiom, we can infer, in order for anyone to resume living, from some point in the future after death, only a miraculous resurrection, by the God who can remember how to faithfully rebuild those persons, would suffice. From this, the soul is, clearly, mortal. It can cease to physically exist, and cease being conscious, and, for a time, only exist in God's perfect, limitless, memory. Ironically, naturalistic scientists might, at least partially, agree with this, but what about their ideas about how life came to be? Where does the real scientific evidence point? You might perhaps agree with the biblical saying, "The truth will set you free." Perhaps it sets many free from morbid fear, the fear of superstitions, taught by many of the pagan religions, and, by many of Christendom's denominations who impose blatant misinterpretations of Scripture, taking portions of Scripture out of context instead of letting Scripture interpret Scripture, asserting their own arrogant opinions, going beyond what is written in the Bible canon and teaching the traditions of men, and mischaracterizing God, invalidating the Word of God because of such traditions. Despite the claims of biblical inerrancy, or perceived paradoxes, Hebrews chapter 2 verses 14 and 15, when referring to Jesus Christ, it says, that through his death he might bring to nothing the one having the means to cause death, that is, the devil, and that he might set free all those who were held in slavery all their lives by their fear of death. And so, according to a canonical understanding, the devil was the one who introduced death to the human race, when he thoroughly deceived Eve into disobeying God. The devil will be brought to nothing. He, along with Hades, the common grave of mankind, all will ultimately be cast into the symbolic lake of fire mentioned in the book of Revelation, symbolizing permanent destruction, as if by fire, what the Bible calls the second death. So there will be no more devil, and there will no longer exist the type of death that we have experienced, death derived from original sin. It will be no more. 1 John chapter 3 verse 8 says that for this purpose the Son of God was made manifest, to break up the works of the devil. That would include all of those misleading, faith-destroying doctrines that have been taught to various people down through the ages, including today, and, of course, death inherited from Adam. So, that is a very large part of the biblical narrative, and it seems that many people believe in it. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist and evolutionary scientist, has, on occasion, enunciated what seems to be his mission statement in life. He argues that if a personal God does not exist, then we would live only in a universe that is blind, pitiless, and indifferent to our existence, and nothing more, nothing beyond nature. So perhaps in order to try and get closer to the truth, he has adopted this polemical position of materialist atheism, for the sake of scientific rigor. Even if you don't agree with some of his conclusions to that question, Dawkins has certainly framed the problem in a provocative enough way, so as to give many of us a good hard kick in the rear end perhaps, maybe prompting some people to think more seriously harder about this very real existential puzzle. Maybe we should applaud him for doing, at least, that. Unfortunately, although not appearing to be lukewarm or indifferent about this disturbing existential subject, he, most of the time, seems to consistently sweep the entropy principle under the rug, as do some others. We must expect better from someone of his apparent intellectual capacity. If Dawkins is willing to vitriolically ridicule the more traditional faith of others, then he, or anyone like him, must, in principle, equally be open to criticism of his own faith and the claimed creative powers of Darwinian evolution, natural selection, and mutations, a hypothesis that some now call the neo-Darwinian synthesis. In this respect, the choice is either God or evolution. For the ultimate creator there doesn't seem to be any serious third possibility. How do we reconcile all of that with the knowledge that the second law of thermodynamics points us to a more ordered, more organized beginning? Evolutionists, creationists, and many others have long pointed out the entropy law, which underpins and provides the explanation for the second law of thermodynamics, and it is also claimed by some as an overwhelming statistical mechanical argument against a creative upward idea of Darwinian evolution, and that the proven, actual, Darwinian processes are conversely overwhelmingly downward, degenerative, and, naturally, inevitably destructive to life. So how could the observable, proven, forms of natural evolution ever, possibly, create conscious souls? Even according to secular mainstream science, it seems that the law of increasing entropy is a ubiquitous principle throughout the universe, so even with natural selection, why would Darwinian evolution, natural selection of genetic mutations, not also be progressively destructive overall, just like all other natural processes of change in the universe? This law applies to every system in the natural world that has ever been looked at. The mathematical proof and experimental evidence are overwhelming, and it has been unassailable, scientifically irrefutable. This is the principle that popularizers, like Dawkins and others, seem to continually, perhaps deliberately, overlook, when imposing their bleak nihilistic philosophy on the general public. But instead of overlooking the theological implications of the second law, we should be giving these scientific principles the most attention of all. From this, an intelligently designed, more ordered beginning to reality might appear more plausible to many people, if they were made aware of these, experimentally established, facts. If this information was made more clear to everyone, there might be far less nihilism, fewer suicides, fewer mass shootings in schools, and the like. So, in recent times the argument rests on just how functionally specific genetic code is, or isn't. How much of the DNA is functional? How much of it is junk? If a large portion of it is junk, then the argument, although still somewhat shaky, might at least seem more tenable, that blind natural processes perhaps were gradually finding a use for it, over time, and evolving upwardly by natural selection, although the argument for downward devolution does not necessarily rely on this idea being wrong. And so, on the other hand, if most of it is found to be functionally specific, then this implies that it was intelligently designed and programmed by an intelligent programmer, and any negligible bits of junk would only be the result of downward decay processes. So what is going on here? To try and answer this question, it seems obvious that we might want to ask a qualified geneticist who has worked in this area for quite some time. Dr. John Sanford, a retired Cornell professor who co-invented the gene gun technique of genetically engineering plants, shows in his book, Genetic Entropy, that the primary axiom of Darwinian evolution is false. The primary axiom is the foundational evolutionary premise that life is merely the result of mutations and natural selection. In addition to showing compelling theoretical evidence that whole genomes must in fact degenerate over time, his book strongly refutes the Darwinian concept that man is just the result of a random and pointless natural process. This was published back in 2012, and since then the empirical science has been confirming his arguments, ever more strongly as more and more functional code in the DNA is being discovered. Evolutionists still attempt to argue that this decay process might not always apply to populations of living systems because of the principle Charles Darwin and many others observed a long time ago: natural selection sometimes acts on variations in living organisms, and since these organisms are constantly growing, replicating, and changing, it is argued therefore that at least a small portion of a population might be able to overcome the entropy law, despite the vast amount of deaths, perhaps on the rarest of occasions overcome, and somehow, from typographical duplication errors within genes, natural selection might reverse the statistical mechanics of increasing disorganization in the genetic code, and then pass such supposedly hypothetical, serendipitous improvements of increased functional complexity on to the next generation. Yes, that old chestnut, mutations, again. It's getting a bit old, don't you think? When it comes to the ideology of mutationism, what is often not told, although natural selection is real, those other ideas mentioned, that apparently are claimed to be somehow based upon it, are speculative, not proven fact, and thus far repeatedly in disagreement with much experimentally reproducible evidence. But can such consistent scientific evidence alone rule out such evolutionistic beliefs that are expounded by neo-Darwinian evangelists? Are they just superstitions, or might there be an exception to this rule somewhere, that supports this seemingly otherwise superstitious mutationistic dogma? Creationists are often accused of putting their spin on things, and some people say that atheists and evolutionists put forth a lot of convoluted excuses for their contradictory ideas that are opposite to consistent natural experience, so science requires us to be rigorous. A properly controlled observable demonstration is required. But the evolutionists have not produced such a demonstration. And that, for science, is very, very significant. And so some evolutionists appeal to lots of time, beyond human timescales, as a means of trying to escape the need for proper experimental scientific evidence to support their claims, but this is a cop-out, an ad hoc excuse, and a crudely imagined favored escape from the fact that such experimental evidence required for scientific investigation is always against their fanciful ideas, their unsatisfactory and incomplete notions of naturally increasing functional complexities, and their deliberate ignoring of statistical principles that underpin the second law, the entropy law, and making their ridiculous claim that it somehow does not apply to evolution, and somehow does not prevent, or not logically underscore the impossibility of, this imagined uphill type of Darwinian evolution via these unsubstantiated hypothesized uphill genetic mutations.
Stop right there. I know what some of you out there are thinking. Richard Lenski's famous experiment with E. coli bacteria proved that they could evolve new functions. Right? Yes, that's right. They did evolve new functions. Does this prove that evolution can go uphill? Does this evidence substantiate Darwin's hypothetical tree of life? Actually, no. Sorry if some of you are disappointed. And here is why. A typical taboo, imposed on secular thinking, is to go outside of naturalism, and if someone dares to go outside of it and talk about God, they are chastised by the God of the Gaps objection. Thus you are supposedly not allowed to even ask the question. Thus a thinly veiled argument by exclusion has been put in place to protect the materialist paradigm. But those lateral thinkers, who are not afraid to think outside the box and who refuse to obey such stupidly restrictive rules, are not afraid to ask the following. What about the macroevolution hypothesis? In an age of reason, what kinds of added information need to be written for a new species with entirely new novel body parts? What kind of new digital code is required? Could it ever have been formed by mindless natural processes, or is intelligent input the only possible way it can happen? Of course a creationist is allowed to ask such a question, because such a person does not unreasonably exclude a priori the possibility of allowing a divine foot in the door, although he does have a prior commitment to proving intelligent creation, and often the existence of God, and some people see that as a problem. But, if we are truly objective, then let's strip away all of that bias or anti-bias and just look at the evidence. Let's weigh the upward evolution hypothesis against the God hypothesis. When writing computer code, the language needs to be very specific, otherwise, it doesn't work. The same has been more and more proven true for DNA code as the research continues. Different kinds of organisms cannot crossbreed. There seems to be a species boundary for genetic variation that quite often cannot be observably exceeded. It appears likely to be the reason why various kinds are observed to remain separate and distinct from one another. The major reason for this is most often the differences and the incompatibilities in their DNA code, even quite often with species that appear similar to one another. Also, genetic damage, copying errors, and information loss usually results in harm to the organism. Downward subspeciation might also be accountable for similar-looking animals that, when crossbreeding is attempted, only seem to produce sterile hybrid offspring, and even if it is ever successful would in rare cases not create any new genetic information according to the modern understanding of genetic principles and information theory. For example, when a horse and a donkey mate and produce a mule, in most cases a mule is sterile. It cannot procreate. Certainly, corrupted computer code never benefits the software, but cripples its functionality, and often stops it from working. there is no reason to think that it's not highly probable for living things. What if you got a computer program to randomly generate letters on several pages? What would be the chances of those letters forming proper meaning, a cohesive book, with paragraphs, sentences and correct grammar and correct spelling as well as a cohesive narrative? Any reasonable sane person would immediately conclude that it is impossible. And yet that is a clue to the complexity of the type of information in the DNA language. It is only reasonable to question if such complex functional code could be generated naturally somehow from random chemistry, and without the protective membrane of a cell, even if in the implausible event that all the proteins had formed somehow and organized themselves correctly in order to create such a trial process. Based on current scientific discoveries, that idea is unthinkable. This argument is reasoning up from things that have been discovered and trying to imagine numbers that the human mind cannot grasp. Scientists admit that they have no idea for any naturalistic model with sufficient explanatory power, that can provide any plausible basis, as to how the first life form emerged from non-life, without intelligent causation. It seems highly implausible that someone will fill a container with a mix of primordial chemicals, find some kind of right conditions to keep it in, and then witness life emerge from it. Anyone who works in this area will tell you that this is just wild imagination with no basis in reality at all. But some people who don't believe abiogenesis to be plausible, still say that they think macroevolution to be possible. Given what geneticists now know, is that way of thinking well-founded? Many people say that the simplest of life is a bacterium. Dr. Brian Miller writes that bacteria of all levels of complexity must generate in their cell membranes at least 100,000 ATP molecules per second from micron squared to simply maintain their integrity against the constant thermodynamic forces disrupting their homeostatic stability. A drop in power results in the metabolism halting and the cell irreversibly decomposing into an amorphous conglomeration of simpler chemicals. Life is a non-equilibrium system and nature always tries to move things toward a state of equilibrium, from low to high entropy. For life to be created you need non-repetitive functional information and an engine that converts energy in very specific ways to a low entropy system. You can only have this with pre-existing information. Can this kind of sophisticated mechanization and coded information ever be generated without intelligent causation? Chemicals have never been observed by themselves to move in a life-friendly direction. Those are the scientific facts. Since the mapping and sequencing of genomes have become possible, evolutionary scientists can question the hypothetical argument as to whether natural selection and random variation can generate the varying levels of complexity that we see in biology, and it exposes serious problems with the idea that it's even possible for any naturalistic evolution process to create higher complexities. The possibility of the hypothetical macroevolution idea being able to happen ever, like this, needs to be fully examined. Getting something to upwardly evolve into something new by natural selection is questionable. It requires new higher-ordered genetic information to emerge somehow, and this has never been seen. Various creationists and even some evolutionists now claim that according to information theory, posited upward evolution goes against the mathematical argument that underpins the entropy law, which is making many remain humbly cautious. Dr. Michael Behe is a big fan of a famous ongoing evolution experiment being conducted in the laboratory by Dr. Richard Lenski, a professor at Michigan State University. He has had a great experiment going on for the past 25 years or more. In the early 1990s, he decided to take a common bacteria, called E. coli, and grow it in a little flask. Just a little bit in a little flask, and let it grow until it essentially used up all the nutrients in the flask. And then the next day he came in and took a portion of it and put it in a new flask with new nutrients in it and let it grow for a number of generations, 6 or 7 a day, and then the next day did the same thing, and the next day the same thing, and then the next day the same thing. And over the period of 3 decades or so that he's been working on that, The bacteria have gone through over 50,000 generations. That's equivalent to say 1,000,000 years in the lifespan of a species like mammals, in some sense, say, a large animal, like us. And there have been trillions upon trillions of different bacteria that have been born and died in his flasks. Early on in the experiment, he showed that some of the mutations were beneficial. So, he confirmed that, yes, evolution can happen because beneficial helpful mutations come along and they will outgrow other bacteria in the flask and take over the place, and other helpful mutations can proceed from that, classic Darwinian evolution. But in the early days, although he could see that some mutations occurred and some bacteria grew faster, he didn't know where in the DNA the mutations had happened, simply because the techniques and the machinery for doing so hadn't been invented yet. It was hard to track down. All he knew was that things were getting better and better. But later on then, new techniques became available in science where you could determine the exact sequence of DNA, and you could see what the mutation was that was causing the adaptation, causing the helpful change. And it turns out that he located dozens of different changes. But again, most of them were degradatory, degenerative mutations. They either destroyed the function of a gene, or they degraded the function of a gene, made it worse, and the ones that weren't, kind of tweaked pre-existing genes a little bit faster or a little bit slower. He didn't see anything like the evolution of some new complex system like the flagellum, nothing remotely like that. He says, I'm a big fan of this experiment because it does not put out a model. It is not a computer model. It's not a theory. Lenski just let his evolution experiment run its course and observed the results. Mutations either broke or degraded the genes. So the bacteria were improving more by devolution than by evolution. He uses an analogy. Suppose you had a car, and the most important thing to your survival at the time was the gas mileage. What could you do to improve the gas mileage of your car quickly? One thing you could do is rip out the back seat and throw it away. Back seats are helpful, but if your life depended on you getting better gas mileage right now, that would be a beneficial improvement. The problem for that, for Darwin's theory, is that ripping the back seat out of the car doesn't tell you how you make a back seat. Darwin's theory needs to show that organisms can improve by building things, and that is what has been missing in Lenski's terrific experiment. Every year, about 1 billion people contract malaria. That's 1 billion times 1 trillion cells that are made each year on the planet. When scientists observed antibiotic resistance, they never saw new molecular machines being created and no new genes being made, despite the fact that it had so many chances. Evolutionary theory would predict that something new would be created from that, but it wasn't seen. He says, the discovery that many beneficial mutations are actually destructive or degradatory mutations, puts a huge monkey wrench into Darwinian theory. Not only can't Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection build complex systems, it has a strong tendency to degrade them. We see that overwhelmingly the good mutations come about by breaking old genes. So, you're not making something new, you're throwing out something you already had. We see it in bacteria, we see it in mammals, we see it in birds, we see it everywhere. Everywhere that's been looked at so far. September 2019. Natural selection has only been observed to, at best vary, or reduce information. More specifically, reduced information or varied information is all there is for nature to select from, apart from what is already good. It is often selected out of a population to create variation within the same species of organisms. Over time, a gene pool has the potential to become more genetically impoverished, and even more so if sections of a population of organisms are isolated from each other, while other sections of a population die out. This situation is commonly known as a genetic bottleneck. It is well recognized that inbreeding also increases the likelihood of more genetic errors, and their phenotypical significance, negatively affecting things to a greater degree in a more isolated population. So, it is only sometimes seen to eliminate genetic information, often sustaining more genetic errors and genetic diseases, but it has never been observed to create new more complex information. This is an entropic principle. It seems that you're only losing information and you don't get it back. This appears to be one of the processes of genetic entropy, which, many argue, opposes Darwinian evolution as a creative process. Imagine the scene. A creationist, while in a room full of evolutionists, asserts that no experiment has ever been done that demonstrates molecules demand evolution. If it were true, he says, surely scientists would have seen it, in the lab, by now, but they haven't, because entropy always increases toward a maximum in a closed system. But an evolutionist smugly tells him that he is wrong, and that his ideas about entropy must be wrong somehow, because there has been an experiment that clearly demonstrates upward evolution of increasing organized complexity, by using bacteria, in a lab. They cite Richard Lenski's evolution experiment with the bacteria E. coli. This is the smoking gun. They say that evolution can sometimes go uphill, and give something positive for nature to select, because the bacteria evolve the new ability to metabolize citrate. The creationist cannot refute it and is deeply humiliated, and walks out of the room with his head hung low, now contemplating the ultimate futility of his existence. The atheists and the hardcore evolutionists thus triumphantly celebrate, and say to each other, now we are finally free of God, from the science room, once and for all. Now we are confident that we are not accountable to a God for our behavior, for God is just a concept, a myth, born from ignorance and incredulous human imagination, so we are free to make up our own rules. Oh yes, it all comes down to survival of the fittest and nothing more. Nature is the creator, not any God at all. Thus Lenski's experiment has finally proven that the Genesis account of creation in the Bible is nothing more than mythology, and instead, evolution did it all, and we atheists shall rule the world by making the rules, and we can all have sex with whomever or whatever we want to, and however we like, because such a benevolent lawmaker does not exist. And we've finally got something substantial to tell those annoying Jehovah's Witnesses, why they need not bother us anymore, when the next time they come gently knocking on our door, interrupting our football game on TV, or our favorite movie, or whatever. And as for those creationist types, with their Noah's Ark, and Genesis flood story from the Bible, we can finally laugh them out of the science room, and resume going about our business unfettered by the chains of religion. We'll finally be rid of all those crackpots at long last. And anyone who in the science room dares utter the phrases, intelligent design or God did it, will henceforth be expelled from the science room as a heretic, deeply humiliated in front of his peers and stripped of his career. And we shall all gloat, with jubilant euphoria. And, while we're about it, let's reinstate all those eugenicists, and we can eliminate the weak from the human population, and create superhumans, the scientific way, without any need for compassion. But seriously, scientists very rarely if ever talk that way, and aside from that rather interesting thought experiment, we are talking about Richard Lenski's long-term evolution experiment. So, is it true then? Does this definitively prove that belief in God is only wishful thinking? Is the Bible just the word of man? Or were the evolutionists not also engaging in wishful thinking after all, wishfully hoping that natural selection can filter out all the genetic mistakes in life, and at the same time create new and more complex stuff from happy accidents in the genes? Is that the ultimate explanation for the creation of all biological diversity? Did Lenski's experiment really refute the creationists' skepticism of that? On the surface, it might have seemed that way, at least at first, especially in the early days when it was almost impossible to track the specific location of a mutation in a genome. At least that is the way it was before the early 2000s. So, back in February 1988, Michigan State University biologist Richard Lenski filled 12 flasks with a glucose-based growth media, and used Escherichia coli bacteria for the experiment. 1% of each population were transferred into fresh medium. Every 500 generations, 75 days, right after the daily transfers were finished, he added a cryoprotectant to the previous day's cultures. This protectant helped protect the cells from the damage that comes from freezing and thawing. He stored these samples at -80 degrees Celsius, where they provided a frozen, but viable, fossil record, fossils that could be revived and analyzed at some time in the future. Generation after generation, day after day, this procedure continues. It has been running for many years. In 2008, Dr. Lenski's lab discovered that at somewhere about generation 31,500, some E. coli could utilize citrate. They could gain nutrients from it. But E. coli are not usually able to metabolize citrate as a food source under normal oxygen conditions. The other 11 lines of E. coli, that they also have been breeding in the lab during those years, had not been able to utilize citrate, even after more than 75,000 generations. Thus some evolutionists claimed this to be a distinctive uphill mutational step, added complexity, the type of thing that hypothetically could go incrementally part way to building a Darwinian Tree of Life. But, when the right tools became available, it was eventually discovered that this result occurred due to a mutation in the CT gene for this one strain of the bacteria. E. coli is typically defined as being citrate negative under normal aerobic conditions, but these E. coli had become an exception. Somehow they became citrate positive. Lenski argued that this strain of E. coli had evolved into a new species. It had what seemed to be a new ability, when it could utilize citrate under aerobic conditions. There were other mutations cited as well. They observed resistance to the I circumflex virus due to mutation of the MALT gene, and down-regulating this unused metabolic pathway would be beneficial for the bacteria in that environment, and coincidentally it conferred resistance against the I circumflex virus. However, no new parts were required, just already existing pieces. Entropy had not decreased, genetic complexity had not increased. They also saw development of larger cell volumes in all 12 E. coli populations, and the greater amount of phosphoenolpyruvate available to drive glucose uptake in two populations, thought to be perhaps due to the altered peptide or glycan cell wall synthesis, or timing of synthesis. It was probably due to an insertion in the genetic region that is hypothesized to have inactivated the PIKF gene, which usually yields an increase of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, at the expense of phosphoenolpyruvate, PEP. Producing less ATP and more PEP coincidentally coordinates greater ability to uptake glucose. It was all pre-existing stuff, used differently, nothing added. Nothing new had arisen. No extra information. The second law of thermodynamics had not been violated, complexity had not increased. But what about the citrate utilization? Had a novel gain of function mutation been demonstrated? The atheists were religiously hoping that it had definitively proven a novel function gain, and on the surface it seemed that way. However, it turns out, unsurprisingly, that E. coli, in the wild, are known to utilize citrate sometimes. It had already been known that E. coli had sometimes been citrate positive. Yes, E. coli already had the gene for citrate utilization present in them. So this was not a true example of the claimed macro uphill evolution at all, because it had not 100% evolved without the pre-existing gene to utilize citrate. The pre-existing gene was just expressed under different conditions. The genetic information already existed in Lenski's cultures, it did not originate de novo. Since there was citrate already present in the experiment, it is not surprising that they might, eventually, utilize citrate under aerobic conditions. So what was demonstrated here? All that was seen, in all of that, was disruption, degradation, or loss of genetic information. The lab-dependent E. coli could not survive outside their very specialized environment. They actually are less fit overall compared to wild E. coli in any other environment. Entropy had increased, just like in everything else ever observed. Once again, the evolutionists' claims about it were demonstrated to be disingenuous, superstitious nonsense. Rather than natural evolution growing stronger like a muscle when getting exercise, it is instead like a muscle continually succumbing to atrophy, under the punishing relentlessness of entropy and degradation. Sir Arthur Eddington prophetically said, that if you have a pet theory of the universe that goes against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing left for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. How would your feeble human mind imagine a God? Is the hand of Almighty Jehovah cut short? Would he not be able to design into living things a measure of ability to adapt to different environments? When will those Darwinists ever learn? Perhaps some biblical wisdom is in order. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 21 and 22 says, "Make sure of all things, hold fast to what is fine. Abstain from every form of wickedness." So, don't fool yourself. If things are intelligently designed, then there are rules for it all, and there are consequences.
So, the basis of all scientific reasoning, our uniform and repeated experience with all things, which can be described and explained mathematically, is that specified complexity only gets degraded and destroyed over time via any known unguided natural process. And with natural selection of genetic mutations, we can observe the same result in small isolated populations, and no one has observed the opposite, the sort of belief that requires the desperate kind of faith only an atheist might possibly have, wishful thinking, based on unconstrained fanciful imagination. We need far more than just that, before we can honestly ever call it scientific fact, so then why do some do that? An irrelevant distraction away from the fundamental argument is often where evolutionists also assume that just because every life form on Earth has DNA, that this is sometimes taken for granted by some people as proof of common ancestry, which is at least in some but not all cases, a proven actuality, and claim to somehow refute intelligent design. But this argument is only based on similarities, and is therefore a logical fallacy. We can use an analogy to demonstrate the bad reasoning. Computer codes are all written in zeros and ones, but no one thinks that this is in of itself reason enough to deny the existence of intelligent software developers. The real question is whether or not such analogies can be applied to living things, and make a determination as to whether such processes are purely natural or alternatively are contingent on the existence of a designer or master programmer at the fundamental level of DNA code and the molecular machines that coexist along with it, some of which then remake the DNA code again, so that this chicken and egg cycle continues indefinitely. Anyone who ignores these fundamental first principles might be revealing something else about themselves that they might not wish to reveal. It is not rational to dismiss these questions. So, we must look more closely at the fundamental aspects, the axioms upon which the macroevolution belief system is based. Can natural selection accomplish what many Darwinian evolutionists have chosen to believe in, the teaching of which some people dogmatically assert on others? Is there a scientific and proper theoretical basis to investigate this problem? Thanks to advancements in modern genetics, yes, there is. As has been discussed, all experiments thus far show how abiogenesis cannot happen. All observations thus far have shown only how upward macroevolution doesn't happen at the DNA level. Instead, it is repeatedly shown how things go the opposite way, they degrade, over time. Is evolution the ultimate creator of life and species? Or is God, perhaps the God of the Bible, Jehovah, the primary cause of it all? If, in the science room, we aren't allowed to say, God did it, if we cannot appeal to what is commonly known as a God of the gaps argument, then where does that leave an atheistic scientist? Well, you could conceive of a typographical error in the copying process of a book, making a sentence within a paragraph better. Even though it is very unlikely, it is logically possible, ignoring of course that we haven't explained what made the paper and bindings of the book, nor the mechanism that printed the information, nor how the letters were arranged into meaningful language, to begin with. So perhaps a copying error might make part of the DNA code better, as the materialist evolutionist might want to believe. However, even if that were true, we know that there are, overwhelmingly, many more genetic errors, mutations, continually occurring in life, and it is overwhelmingly likely that, just like typographical errors in a book, most genetic errors will make a genome worse, as most mistypes would make a book worse, even if these errors are not immediately lethal to the organism, as we know most are not, immediately. The book is still somewhat readable, the organism can still reproduce, albeit imperfectly. Thus, this life or death process of blind natural selection cannot filter most of them out, because it can't right away directly see them. And herein is the critical point within all of this, the distinction that seems to devastate the atheists, materialists, neo-Darwinists, belief system. This blind undirected natural selection process is not affected by most, nearly all, mutations. In the vast majority of those cases, it has nothing to grab hold of when the parent organism is able to pass on these deleterious duplication mistakes to its offspring before it dies. Therefore the vast majority of mutations, those insidious, unselectable, deleterious genetic errors, remain, and so get passed on to the offspring and the next generation, and the next, and so on, and thus mistakes will perpetually accumulate. This means that the level of genetic entropy, the amount of scrambled undetectable, and therefore unselectable, useless genetic informational junk, will accumulate and continually increase over time until it reaches the maximum possible amount, at which that species of organisms cannot survive any longer, and go extinct. It is inevitable. It seems intuitively obvious. Any so-called junk DNA is actually the product of genetic decay, the degenerative process that nature could not select out for elimination, and thus could not prevent it from replicating in subsequent generations. This is not a synthesis at all, but an unstoppable destructiveness. We age and die for much the same reason. The individual cells in our bodies reproduce by dividing and replicating, and so one generation after the next, successive generations, are accumulating more and more mutations, until too many of those individual cells eventually have malfunctioned, and this inevitable, ubiquitously repeated, cumulative effect, will thereby eventually kill all of us, if something else doesn't do it first. By extension, this appears to apply to all life on Earth, as far as we know. That is, of course, in the absence of divine intervention from God, it would seem. This, fundamentally, is in essence alluding to a similar theological question that says, why does God permit evil and suffering? And science alone may not be able to answer it completely, but the scientific method does at least inform us that it is the natural result of entropy and decay. So the ideological evolutionist, who is committed to excluding God from the big picture, but who wants to believe that natural evolution did it all, might find such an argument shocking and distasteful. But for those with the Judeo-Christian perspective, this outcome is no surprise at all. This is exactly what we might expect to see, in agreement with the biblical model's predictions. That is, without God, the world is doomed. We are in desperate need of a savior. So, who do you think is more rational? Which of the two opposing belief systems makes more logical sense to you? Which model or belief system does the mathematical, experimental, empirical science agree with more? What do you think? Creationists, of one kind or another, might assert, there has not been one example in the laboratory that even remotely shows how anything like this could ever arise at all. If upward progressive evolution were a real process of nature, given our current theoretical understanding of the age of the universe and the age of the earth, and the time required for certain things to happen, this would suggest that, if upward natural evolution was a reality, we should have witnessed many times some form of genetic upward improvement, increasing organized complexity, in the many species being looked at in modern times by now, to make plausible the idea that such an imagined upward process firstly does exist, and secondly could fast enough create all the biological diversity that we can observe in the world right now, and in this way could ever hope to be an adequate explanation of what we see in the fossil record, And yet we humans haven't recreated such a process in the laboratory, not even once has any such uphill process ever been demonstrated, so it seems creationists are justified in asserting that this casts further doubt on the macroevolution idea, as if there isn't enough doubt already. There has been, what genetic scientists have demonstrated, plenty of joining and recombination of already existing genetic material, but no new more complex functional genetic code with new novelty has ever been seen getting naturally created. Genes of greater functional complexity have not been seen getting created by accident from previously less complex, less functional genes. But experiments and observations have only demonstrated genes being broken, actually degraded. Even the so-called beneficial mutations are really degraded, damaged, broken, and therefore corrupted genetic code. Such an upward process has never been proven, despite the rare beneficial mutations. That is an empirical fact, recognized even among many evolutionists, even those who like to speculate and wonder if they might have witnessed a speciation event in its formative stages, because the idea seems unfalsifiable since it appears you've always got the ad hoc excuse that a human lifetime would not be long enough to either falsify it or prove the emergence of new phyla, or more specifically, the emergence of greater functional complexity. This appeal to unobservable time periods beyond human timescales, to excuse the absence of evidence for natural processes creating functional complexity instead of an intelligent designer, is, in some sense, similar to how some physicists appeal to an unfalsifiable and proven hypothetical multiverse to try and naturalistically explain, in evolutionary terms, the apparent fine-tuning and the apparently super unlikely balanced laws of physics that allow our very existence to remain possible, and thereby to exclude the question of the possibility of an intelligently designed set of specified physical laws. So in biology, with materialist evolutionists there are only atheistic assumptions, from similarities found in fossils and living things. Creationists say that there is not only the absence of evidence for such a naturalistic creative process but also strong evidence against it, based on natural laws. And so some claim that those ideas against intelligent creation have actually been falsified because the evidence points to things being more organized in the past than what they are now. But, despite all the contradictory evidence, evolutionists object and point to beneficial mutations to support their belief system. One thing that such an argument cannot circumvent, which is evident and indisputable, is the well-documented characteristic of damaged genes, some of which cause debilitating diseases, and all mutations, beneficial and detrimental, that have been looked at so far, that are quite often changes caused by typographical errors in the code, are also either genes being remixed, switched on and off, or in many instances tantamount to information loss, but never have scientists experimentally distinguished information gain. So, that is what science has shown us so far. Anything beyond that is only speculation. We need to look at this problem at the fundamental level, the molecular or DNA level. Reasoning from analogy is helpful but ultimately not good enough, but it is at least a good starting point in helping us to partially understand the problem. So let's start with a thought experiment. To understand this problem better, imagine, if you will, you are living on a different planet that has a very corrosive environment. It is like you are back in ancient times, long before printing presses and photocopiers were invented, but in a much harsher environment. A vast library of books exists, enough books to fill something the size of the Empire State Building. Before this vast assortment of information deteriorates beyond repair, which in this thought experiment takes only decades, before rust and moth consume it, before environmental degradation erodes it away, before all those books decay, or get eaten by bugs, bacteria, and mold, we want to try and perfectly preserve the information in all those books, so we need to make perfect copies of all these documents. Skilled copyists called scribes are recruited to painstakingly copy by hand every document, letter by letter, and a new gigantic library is built. Imagine that these copyists are so good that only about 100 typographical errors are made, despite all that copying of such a vast array of books, one letter at a time. But that is not all. About 20 years later, another copy of each of those books must be made again, since the original library has deteriorated because of such bad environmental factors. This process of copying and the recopying of the previous copy keeps repeating itself, generation after generation, 20 years apart at a time, another 200 times. Imagine too, that after a few generations of scribes, they understand the language less and less, until they don't understand it any longer, and are copying text only in parrot fashion, and therefore less likely to correct mistakes. This extra detail was included to show that there is more than one way a system can degrade, and this illustrates how limited our understanding of what the total entropy problem actually is. It is most likely a lot bigger, a lot worse, than what we can imagine. About 4,000 years later, only the recent copies of books, that are 200 generations along, have survived the ravages of time, and remain. In all those resulting copies, how many typographical errors do you think would have accumulated by now? Let's say, according to math, there will be about 20,000 copying errors. 200 generations along, almost 20,000 mistakes have accumulated. Instead of just books, if the library were a computer program, where almost 20,000 mistakes, i.e. 19,900 typographical errors, had crept into the code, do you think it would function very well by now? Would it even function at all? This is similar in some ways to what happens to the cells of people. They divide and make copies of themselves, but the copies are not perfect. Errors creep in each time the cells divide and self-replicate, possibly about 3 errors per cell per day. This seems to be a very fundamental reason why we age and die. But even worse than that is, genetic science has revealed that we pass on at least 100 genetic mistakes to our offspring, therefore each successive generation of humans is accumulating more and more mistakes, more and more typographical errors are creeping into, and accumulating, in the genetic codes of each successive generation of people. Some geneticists think that this explains why the human race, overall, currently appears to be degenerating. For those who have had a materialist, Darwinian, worldview of increasing complexity, this must be shocking, depressing, and hard to accept, but scientific evidence is logical and indifferent to such emotional sentiment. The Human Gene Mutation Database, HGMD, represents an attempt to collate all known, published, gene lesions responsible for human inherited disease. At the time of this writing, maintained in Cardiff by D. N. Cooper, E. V. Ball, P. D. Stenson, A. D. Phillips, K. Evans, S. Haywood, M. J. Hayden, M. M. Chapman, M. E. Mort, L. Azevedo, and M. Mort. So in more recent times, there is a theoretically fundamental way of investigating either the validity or invalidity of the macroevolution hypothesis after all. The millions of years needed excuse can no longer be the ad hoc favored escape of committed atheists, anti-creationists, and materialist evolutionists. The fact is, in the field of genetics there has never been an observed increase in specified information, even when citing rare beneficial mutations. Such imagined increases have only been naturalistic assumptions, and the anti-scientific superstitions of atheists and evolutionists, but nothing real. For an obvious example, there is no single gene for wrinkled skin and aging, but instead there is an increase of errors in the genetic codes of each individual cell, of all extant populations, which appears to be a major part of the aging process. So even fundamentally, at the theoretical and empirical level we can examine it. Let's apply our thought experiment to populations of cells instead of people. Cells are at the most fundamental level of life. We don't know of any other self-replicating lifeforms below the cellular level. Viruses don't self-replicate. Prokaryotic cells might very well be the most fundamentally irreducible self-replicating machines logically possible, or something very close to that. And if that is true, any gradualistic evolution concept appears to be very unsatisfactory, as an attempted explanation of its origin. Due to the cell's humanly incomprehensible functional complexity, it seems that each new generation of cells happens about 1 day at a time as the cells multiply. Let us assume that the mutation rate is 3 mutations per cell per day. For example, in only 200 days, so in this case, it's 200 generations, the cells in your body average 600 additional mutations each already. So despite the error correction systems, an approximate average of 600 somatic mutations per cell have slipped through the net. This is the same mutation rate Sanford says is taking place on average in our cells. So theoretically speaking, in 365.25 days, 1 year, the cells in your body would have accumulated 1095.75 typographical genetic errors, copying errors on average, in only 1 year of life. This means by the time you reach 35 years of age, your cells will average 38,351.25 somatic mutations, and subsequently when you reach 60 years of age, your cells in due course will average 65,745 copying mistakes in their DNA code. By this stage, many of your cells probably have a higher mortality rate. Sections of code have been lost, further impairing their function. That is over 65,000 genetic errors, in addition to the germline mutations that you inherited from your ancestors, the total being about 90,745 mutations in your 3 billion letter genome, with varying amounts of difference in the somatic degeneration within each of your own cells. On average, in total about a third of 0.001% of your genome has become scrambled, which is almost enough to kill you. How utterly tragic and terrible. How can this be? If it only takes not much more than maybe 0.00033% of degenerated code to likely kill you, then could all the good code have come about by chance, necessity, and natural selection? Could it have just evolved, or was it designed? With the most recent generations of human beings, it seems about 99.99966% of good genetic code is required for life functions to continue, for human life to be possible. If that lack of functional code is not enough to kill you, then it would probably shorten your lifespan. So it is reasonable to assume a minimum longevity limit where the perpetuation of the species is no longer possible. The evidence for the biblical perspective might look very convincing when extrapolating back from today's average human lifespan. The redundant portion of the code seems very small when compared to the remaining, overwhelmingly large, functional portion of it, the functions of which seemingly must be almost completely irreducible. Sanford reasons, the idea of macroevolution suggests that things are getting better somehow through natural selection. Genetic entropy is obviously the opposite of this imagined upward movement and says that things are going downhill, getting worse, and many of our observations so far overwhelmingly agree with it. And so basically, we have two radically different worldviews. There is one group of people who imagine things are, naturally, getting better and better, and there is another group of people who, from empirical data, think things are naturally going down. Which one of these two opposing ideas is right? Could they perhaps both be right? What has proper experimental science demonstrated? We all understand that there is a natural degenerative process. Sometimes this is referred to as entropy, and sometimes this is referred to as the second law of thermodynamics. But when we use those terms, sometimes we get caught up in very narrow definitions, very precise mathematical formulas, and some people tend to lose sight of the common sense element of this, but it is the law of degeneration. We strive to maintain and repair things because they, eventually, run out of energy, fall apart, become more disorganized, more random, rust, break down, deteriorate, and so forth. People also call this Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, given enough time, it inevitably will. This degeneration happens throughout the universe. Useful energy eventually becomes unusable energy. Physical things wear out and become more disordered, broken, and disorganized over time. It also applies to information. How long do computers keep working? It also applies to the biological world and the genetic code. However, evolutionists believe that entropy doesn't always apply to living things. They want to believe that natural selection somehow reverses entropy and allows everything to get better and better, going against the vector of the universe.
It has to be said, before we go any further, that while initially, this all seems to be quite depressing, when considering that everything in the universe is decaying, running down, accumulating more and more entropy, it is also a reason for a positive outlook. Because contrary to what atheists might say, if things ultimately can only become disorganized through natural processes, then this implies that the universe and life started in a more highly organized, functional and ordered condition. Therefore an intelligent creator was needed for our existence. By extension, the Christian worldview looks more tenable. So, if every complex thing in existence is contingent upon an intelligent creator, perhaps there is no need to let the atheist's bleak philosophy of futility suck the joy out of your life and leave you as a shriveled husk, only a shadow of your former self, a nihilistic blubbering mess curled up in the fetal position in the corner of the room on the floor sucking your thumb. It is fundamentally that serious. This darkness demonstrates how limited humans are when on their own. If there ultimately does exist a God who cares about us, then pondering the meaning of our existence or hope beyond our current lifespan might not seem pointless after all. Even if this is outside the scope of science, can your mind accept that perhaps some things might forever remain beyond human comprehension and in some sense outside the scope of science, such as how a past eternal almighty God could have ever existed in the first place? But at least science can prove that things begin more ordered, differentiated, and organized, and it seems that the philosophical and theological implications of this are huge. Those very prominent pair of naturalistic ideas, the macroevolution hypothesis and the abiogenesis concept, in some sense seem to be unfruitful works that belong to the darkness, and we should expose them for what they are: scientifically unfruitful, and quite possibly myths, superstitions. Evolutionary science should not fill the gaps of ignorance with mythology. Even worse, they might unnecessarily rob people of hope, because this is an existential crisis for many intelligent, self-aware humans. By that, we of course mean all humans, every human alive existing today. So contrary to what some people might assert, we are not completely debunking evolution theory in its entirety. We are not ignoring the proven aspects of biological evolution, but just the unsubstantiated religious portions of it, and, most importantly, the far worse, manifestly superstitious ideas about evolution. Those ideas that have been experimentally and mathematically refuted and debunked by the scientific method as it is understood today. Actually, we are specifically asserting that evolution's creative powers are limited and, more importantly, in some sense non-existent, and therefore intelligence was necessary for the rest of what we see, and ultimately logically necessary for everything that had a beginning to its existence.
Sanford seems to have a good point. The opposite idea, genetic entropy, the progressive loss of novel functional genetic codes, seems to be the elephant in the room, continually ignored by committed atheists and Darwinists. Its effects are observable. The macroevolution hypothesis has never accounted for this empirical fact, because the idea was invented a long time ago before anyone even knew that DNA existed, and of its necessity in the biological process of reproduction and reiteration. Many cannot let go of the shaky belief that evolving systems can develop more complexity over subsequent generations, despite the overwhelming evidence against it. Why that is so might perhaps be a different topic of discussion about human psychology. It certainly doesn't have much to do with science. So Dr. John Sanford, a plant geneticist, who wrote the book entitled Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, like a growing number of modern-day scientists, started out as a hardcore atheistic Darwinian evolutionist, but as time went on, he changed his mind. He explains how the scientific evidence has brought him to understand how mutation and natural selection lead to a loss of information over time, not only in plant genomes but also in other genomes, including the human genome, and explains why the real nature of DNA and mutation points to a young human race, and how this, therefore, refutes neo-Darwinian macroevolutionary theory. Because of the indoctrination of Darwinian theory in the majority of many societies, people have become fearful of genetically modified food. Because this unsubstantiated Darwinian idea of things evolving upward has become so entrenched in the mainstream education systems, and inside the minds of many people, for more than 150 years, and despite since DNA was discovered, evolutionists in Hollywood movies paint a scary picture of the power that genes and their mutations are wildly imagined to have. Sanford, however, thinks that the genetic engineering of crops is crucial to feeding a hungry world. However, considering his research, he says that he has stepped back from the controversy associated with it, because there seem to be better and more urgent things to deal with. Every living system that has existed, the same holds true, whether it be plants, humans, or anything else, they all have genomes, and so like all other life forms, when it comes to humans, the genome is all our genetic material combined. So it's all the genes, all the chromosomes, and in the case of humans, it's made up of approximately 3 billion letters, which is a vast amount of information, and it's like many, many sets of encyclopedias. It's basically an instruction manual on how to build a human cell, and how to build a human body. More accurately, it's less like a book than a computer program. It's like an operating system, but it's vastly superior to any operating system that man has developed. Nothing can come close. Sanford says that every year we realize that it's more and more marvelous than we thought. We have over 100 trillion cells in our bodies, and we are a galaxy of design and complexity, and amazing functionality, but it's the genome that has all the information that enables that. So, it's just an amazing information system. When was the genome fully mapped? The genome was largely completed around 2001, with still gaps remaining to be filled for parts of the genome that had not yet been sequenced. Pretty much all biologists and geneticists he knew in those previous last 10 years, at that time, were awed by the complexity and the marvelous nature of the genome. When the genome was first unveiled, it was announced to be largely junk, and that belief was consistent. Junk DNA was the dominant concept, says Sanford. Well, it seems obvious from this that when it comes to arguments from ignorance, the idea of junk DNA proved to be a whopper. Those who were insistent on the Darwinian idea of junk DNA as a building material for uphill evolution have found themselves in a perpetually shrinking zone of ignorance and incognizance, despite all the evidence that is less and less inherited and more willful. It seems increasingly manifestly wrong, inexcusably so. Sanford continues, in 2007, the ENCODE project was completed, which was phase 2 of the Genome Project. The ENCODE project was looking at the functionality of the genome. This was a huge project, including hundreds of scientists and vast amounts of money, involving scientists from all over the world to do the ENCODE project, just like the Genome Project, and to everyone's surprise, what they found was that the genome was amazingly functional. Over 90% of the genome is actively transcribed, and there is probably more, but we must study more carefully to find the function of the remaining part of the genome. More than that, the genome has multiple overlapping messages. Try to imagine a book and a chapter, and embedded in that chapter, in addition to the obvious meaning of the words in the chapter, are other hidden messages, and that even in the same sentences there might be several messages embedded. Even more astounding is that the DNA has two strands, one running one way and one running the other. For the longest time, they thought the one strand was just for replication and all the information was on the other strand. What they found with the ENCODE project was that on more than 50% of the genome, both strands are read. So it's like reading a sentence forward where it has one meaning, and reading it backward and there is another message there. So it's data compression on the most sophisticated level. There may be other levels of data compression yet to be discovered, possibly 3 or 4 dimensions. It's multidimensional, and one of the things that DNA does, it's like a tape with letters on it, and you read it in a linear way, but it also folds up like origami, and you can make huge architectural structures that fill the genome. And we are just starting to understand that all that folding is like the folding of a protein. It's functional, and it carries information. This seems to be a challenge to the evolutionary worldview, where so much is accredited to randomness, length of time, natural selection over billions of years. For those who are deeply committed to the evolutionary perspective, rationally speaking, you might imagine that they would be surely beginning to acknowledge how the ENCODE project has provided information that they have not had to process before these discoveries, and one might imagine perhaps it is impacting their worldview. Sanford says, I don't think anyone is saying that it affirms their worldview, because it is becoming extremely problematic to explain how the genome could arise, and how there are multiple levels of overlapping information, since our best computer programs can't even conceive of overlapping codes. These overlapping codes are also named polyfunctional DNA, and it vastly compounds this problem for evolution. As a message becomes more and more complex and refined, a text change must be more and more specific in order to enhance that message, and hence the greater the constraint for achieving improvement via any random change. What is the logical outcome? Part of the conclusion states, our analysis confirms mathematically what would seem intuitively obvious: multiple overlapping codes within the genome must radically change our expectations regarding the rate of beneficial mutations. As the number of overlapping codes increases, the rate of potential beneficial mutation decreases exponentially, quickly approaching zero. Retrieved February 16, 2019. Sanford says that the genome dwarfs all the information technology that man has developed. So I think that it's very problematic to imagine how you could achieve that through random changes in the code. Even computer viruses are designed. In all the programs on your computer, there is not a single 0 or 1 that is there by chance, and there is no junk DNA in these codes. More and more, the genome looks like a super set of programs, and it's very hard to imagine how it all came together. More and more it looks like top-down design, and not just bottom-up chance discovery, in making complex systems work. Sanford uses the fairy tale of the princess and the pea as a metaphor. The story goes that the princess proved her special noble character because, even with many mattresses, she could still feel that there was a pea under all the mattresses, and that proved that she was royalty, and so it's a cute story. In terms of genetics, we have a huge genome of 3 billion letters, and chance mutations in this information system, which is like changing zeros and ones in a computer program. So, you have these overwhelmingly deleterious mutations. An atheistic neo-Darwinian evolutionist might imagine a 0 or a 1 changing in a computer program making it better, but it's just phenomenally unlikely. And so, the same thing is happening in the genome, and the mutation rate is extremely high. We have about 3 mutations with every cell division in our body, which is just astounding. We are getting more mutant every day. We are adding about 3 mutations per cell per day. So, all these mutations are coming in and they have tiny effects. If you change one letter in a genome of 3 billion, how much of the information have you lost? Very little. Nonetheless, you have lost some information, and if you don't stop this process, you're eventually going to destroy all the information. If you scramble the letters of the book, eventually it will have no useful information. There are some mutations where you can see an effect, like hemophilia, or a mutation, a specific letter change, causes a specific disease. But the typical mutation is not detectable in any way, by any medical technology. We can see a genome has changed a letter, but we can't know how that has affected the workings of that person. And so, the princess and the pea analogy is saying that Mother Nature or natural selection, which is the princess, and these tiny changes, which is the pea, are many levels removed, like those many mattresses in the story, and basically, selection happens for the whole individual. 100 trillion cells, and contained in every cell are 6 billion nucleotides, and so, Mother Nature is going to decide whether the whole body is going to be selected or not, if to the extent that selection works at all. Therefore, Mother Nature can't see a single nucleotide chain. She's going to choose the whole genome, good genes and bad genes mixed together, and she's just going to say that at the whole organism level, that there is either reproduction, which is survival, or there is death or non-reproduction, meaning non-survival. The idea that Mother Nature, natural selection, can sort out what is happening just above the atomic level as these letters change within our genome, is unthinkable. Unlike in the fairy tale, there is just no way the princess Mother Nature, that is to say, natural selection, could ever detect or influence anything at that distant level. It's too far down. So in effect, Mother Nature is not a princess in this regard. She is not royalty at all. She almost certainly cannot create these kinds of functional and specified things, but rather she most certainly destroys them over time. The ideological evolutionistic claim that she is royalty appears either fraudulent or mistaken. If you go to a middle school biology class, they would present it in a very simple way, where you have a group of organisms and 2 or 3 of them are mutant, and they have some dysfunction and 1 or 2 of them is extra good because they've had a beneficial mutation, so you just select away the bad individuals and let the best individual have extra children, and it is just going to keep getting better overall. However, the reality is, everybody is mutant, and basically all the differences are due to the fact that everybody carries tens of thousands of mutations and each different mutation has a minuscule effect, so that the selection process has nothing to grab hold of. The Darwinian theory relies on the idea that somehow, new genetic code can be created on its own from natural processes, only. Instead, what we see at the genetic level, nothing new is being created, but we are instead actually losing. Just as many scientists readily accept the universe's heat death one day, if things continue as they are, in the future one day we will undergo a gene death. The human race will no longer have enough to survive. Sanford says that it's kind of a trade secret among population geneticists. Any well-informed population geneticist understands that man is degenerating. He says you can find great quotes. For instance, there is a paper written a while back by a prominent population geneticist, Alexei Kondrashov. The title of the paper is, "Why Aren't We Dead 100 Times Over?" This paradox cannot be resolved by invoking beneficial mutations or environmental fluctuations. He is basically addressing the problem: things should be going down, not up, and so in deep, geological time, we should have been extinct a long time ago. A more recent paper by Michael Lynch looks at the mutation problem, and he concludes that the human race is degenerating at 1 to 5% in terms of loss of fitness per generation. He concludes, humanity is degenerating rapidly, and it could be as high as 10% depending on what exactly the mutation rate is, so he is acknowledging the problem and he is saying, in the relatively near future we will see significant impairment of human functionality. Sanford said, one of the population geneticists I was speaking with said that basically, every human geneticist acknowledges that the human race is degenerating. This is shocking. If this is even close to being correct, then if you extrapolate backwards, that would mean that the human race is a lot younger than what we have been led to believe it is, according to evolution theory. You would think that this would be a logical train of thought. We should have indeed been dead 100 times over. That is what evolutionist Kondrashov himself is asking. Why aren't we dead 100 times over? He would definitely believe that we trace back to the first bacterium which evolved maybe 4 billion years ago. And yet, if it's down, not up, how can that be? And so, most of the population geneticists who would acknowledge that we have a huge degeneration problem imagine that it couldn't have been that way in the past, so selection must have been much more efficient in the past, so maybe if we stop taking care of, or helping, the weak, we can perhaps get more natural selection and perhaps stop the problem. Sanford says that the eugenics philosophy is just under the surface, in the evolutionist community, and he's sure that they are thinking about it, but they don't want to talk about it. He says that he has spent years looking at this, and he has done very careful numerical simulations. His conclusion is, increasing the amount of death, and increasing the intensity of selection, doesn't stop it. The problem is so fundamental, that increasing selection pressure doesn't solve it. It doesn't even come close to solving it. This is the essence of aging. One of the things that Michael Lynch, in his paper mentioned was, that because of the nature of this degenerative process, in our own body, there is no prospect of any type of scientific breakthrough, to significantly extend our lifespan, beyond what it is. It's a fundamental reality, and it is very personal, because we are experiencing genetic entropy, personally. No one can contest that. Personal genetic entropy is an incontestable fact, that no scientist on the planet can deny, because it is why we die. And so, what is happening is, every gene, in every chromosome, of every cell, in everybody, is mutating, and that guarantees aging, and death. But the problem is, that these mutations that are accumulating in our bodies, some of them are transmitted to our children, to the next generation. We take all the genes, and mutations, that we've inherited from our ancestors, which are tens of thousands of deleterious mutations in our bodies, and then we add our own contribution to that, about 100 mutations at least, and pass it on to the next generation. So what we have here is not only this deep personal tragedy that causes us to die, but it's passed on to any children we may have. And so it's a tragedy for all of humanity, and it keeps getting worse. It means that we are a perishing people, living in a dying world, and that is so profound, and makes the need for salvation, and a savior, so personal, and so immediate, because there is no circle of life where things just keep staying the same, and it's not an upward spiral of evolution where things keep getting better and better. It is a downward spiral, exactly as described in Scripture. Romans 5 verse 12. The account reads, "That is why, just as through one man, sin entered into the world, and death, through sin, and so death spread to all men, because they had all sinned." It probably comes as no surprise to anyone that John Sanford, who, by his own account, used to be an atheist and a hardcore evolutionist, no longer believes Darwinian evolution to be a creative process, but instead a degenerative one. And so he is now a creationist and an advocate of intelligent design. Sanford said that he initially realized that his research would have major implications for evolution, but he couldn't have guessed how profound the biblical implications are, how profoundly the evidence supports the biblical perspective of a dying universe and a dying world, and that we are dying because of the fall of humankind into sin and death, and that we are desperate and our only hope is Christ. There are of course those more religious people who believe the biblical model regarding these things to be quite plausible. The Bible book of 1 Corinthians 15 verse 22 says, "For just as in Adam all are dying, so also in the Christ all will be made alive." And the book of Romans, chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, says, "For the creation became subject to futility not of its own free will, but for the purposes of him who created it, with the hope that creation itself is to be set free out of slavery to decay, into the liberty of the glory of God's children." Byington translation. So, this is the biblical creationist model that Sanford puts forward. Okay, even if by choice you don't necessarily buy into the religious argument, nevertheless scientifically, with increased understanding of biological systems at the fundamental level, it seems Sanford might at least be getting scientifically closer to the truth about the real nature of evolution in biology, and this has to be taken very seriously indeed. It's certainly not to be illogically dismissed, on the basis of prejudices or emotions against a more traditional biblical religious belief, when it appears that by the mainstream the macroevolution hypothesis is ironically not dismissed either, especially given just how unsubstantiated that particular naturalistic story actually is. So science needs to be consistent and open to the equal examination of both conjectures, until we see evidence one way or the other. And the evidence now points very strongly in one direction, because one thing that genetic entropy theory has in its favor is that it is overwhelmingly supported by empirical evidence, and its empirical and statistical agreement with the entropy principle, whereas the upward macroevolution idea does not even agree with experiment and observation. This alone should make any truly scientific person sit up and take notice, regardless of their philosophical predispositions. In the area of genetics, genetic entropy, degradative downhill devolution, appears to be the simpler of the two opposing explanations, agrees with experiments, and fulfills the falsifiability principle. Here is a thought experiment. The mathematical logic, although oversimplified, is reasonable. Based on 3 mutations per cell per day, 3 times 365.25 times 70 is equal to 76,702.5 old age mutations. Based on 250 previous generations of humans, loosely based on the Genesis flood, accumulating 100 mutations per generation, 100 times 250 is equal to 25,000 inherited mutations. The total number of mutations per current 70-year-old human, 76,702.5 old age mutations plus 25,000 inherited mutations equals 101,702.5 mutations for that 70-year-old person. Maximum generations left to human extinction might be less than 76,702.5 divided by 100 is equal to 767.02 generations maximum upper limit until human extinction. These are conservative estimates. 767 is an unrealistic over-optimistic upper limit, because of all the lethal genetic diseases that will become prevalent exponentially. It is overwhelmingly likely that the tipping point for gene death might be a lot sooner than what anyone can envisage. Also, the numbers on which this rough calculation is based are conservative. Based on these rough estimates, there are far less than 767 generations before the total extinction of humans. Based on each new generation starting every 20 years, time to extinction is far less than 20 times 767 is equal to 15,340 years. So the terrible implications are, there is far less than 15,340 years until the extinction of the human race from too much genetic load, too many mutations, lethal amounts of genetic entropy, if nothing else wipes out humans from the universe first. This is only theoretical, and overly optimistic, as it is becoming apparent that far more younger people of recent times are succumbing to the types of genetic illnesses that previously were only thought to inflict older people. And this is rather disturbing. It is hard to know exactly the tipping point in the deterioration of the human species. Some might infer from more recent evidence that this oversimplified model apparently is wrong, and is conservative. It seems to fall short of the truly horrible picture. Although Dr. John Sanford's general hypothesis was intuitively on the right track, it now seems even his more thoroughly theoretical investigation falls rather short of just how rotten things are, when trying to estimate just how critical and terrible the actual situation is for mammals. If the more recent studies by the Wellcome Sanger Institute are correct, that the average number of mutations at the end of lifespan across species was only around 3,200 mutations, then this paints a very grim picture indeed. Due to these more recent empirical findings, if it only takes 3,200 mutations to kill you, then the situation seems far worse than what anyone had previously estimated from their hypotheses and theories. The human race might be degenerating much faster, and therefore appears to be even younger, and will go extinct a lot sooner than any previous theoretical reckoning. Decay curves, even though they seem to be starting to level out, as a rule, reach a sudden end, a tipping point, when the probabilistic resources within the possibility space have been damaged, and in this case when the possibility space of the system itself has been gradually reduced via degradation. It strongly implies that the gene death of the human race looks inevitable when left to nature. And that is the cold hard logic. If there is some way of preventing this from happening, that is, stopping this and reversing it, science has not found it. When it comes to the human species, the actual science, both theoretical and experimental, seems to only be in agreement with the biblical perspective of a relatively young human race, rather than the much-touted secularist worldviews that appeal to vast deep timescales involving millions of years for humans. Some people might want to relegate the Genesis flood to myth. But what if it's not? If such a non-uniformitarian, supernaturally induced, abnormal event were true, what would be the implications? According to the biblical narrative, the people who lived before the Genesis flood typically had lifespans well over 900 years of age. Some people might wonder, if God is perfect and doesn't make mistakes, then why did God use a global flood, according to Bible chronology probably 2370 BCE, to destroy the world of Noah's day, and then promised afterward never to use a flood in that way ever again? He said, "Never again will I strike down every living thing as I have done." Genesis chapter 8 verse 21. Does this indicate that God made a mistake and was changing his mind? Well, if God is almighty, all-powerful and all-knowing, then the answer to that would be no. It seems that something else must be going on in all of that. The biblical account explains to us why God did what he did, when it says, "The sons of the true God, angelic sons, began to notice that the daughters of men were beautiful, so they began taking as wives all whom they chose." It seems that the fallen angels had corrupted the genetic codes of the human race in a way that was not natural, by making human bodies for themselves and breeding with humans, and their hybrid offspring contaminated the experiment and might have invalidated it, by perverting the natural course of things. Then Jehovah said, "My spirit will not tolerate man indefinitely, because he is only flesh." Accordingly, his days will amount to 120 years. Genesis chapter 6 verses 2 and 3. The hybrid offspring from those rebellious demons were called the Nephilim, and were on the earth in those days and afterward. During that time the sons of the true God continued to have relations with the daughters of men, and these bore sons to them. They were the mighty ones of old times, the men of fame. Verse 4. So the biblical account clearly shows that those angels were wicked and forsook their own proper dwelling place. Jude 6. Accordingly, after the flood had destroyed the human population of that time, God put those rebellious angels in some sort of condition that prevented them from taking human form again. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 says, "Certainly God did not refrain from punishing the angels who sinned, but threw them into Tartarus, putting them in chains of dense darkness to be reserved for judgment." There is the issue of universal sovereignty, inferred here, whose right it is to make the rules, and to set moral standards. Satan, along with the disobedient fallen angels the demons, for perhaps well over 1,600 years, were allowed to try their own methods of rulership over humankind, it would seem, and, according to the biblical account, it was a disaster of monumental proportions. The entire world had degenerated into abject wickedness. Certain Darwinian principles seem to reflect satanic, demonic thinking, which may have been applied on the people before the flood, such as might is right, survival of the fittest, the weak fall by the wayside but the strong will survive, and so on. People of that time might possibly have been indoctrinated with a cruel, psychopathic, unsympathetic, unforgiving attitude toward each other, and it is easy to imagine that Satan and the demons would have imposed a very abusive, oppressive, tyrannical form of rulership over the people. If you at all still doubt this particular interpretation, in the 1st century CE, the Apostle Peter in the first book named after him, had already made mention of the spirits in prison, who had formerly been disobedient when God was patiently waiting in Noah's day, while the ark was being constructed. 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 19 and 20. From these accounts, it seems to be reminiscent of the many superhero stories of our modern movie-making era, and we can perhaps easily imagine that such fallen wicked angelic beings, that can no longer transform themselves into humans, might vicariously, in some sense, through those films relive those former times, when the world seemed to be theirs for the taking, when the world was less removed from its original perfection, and human aging was only starting to become apparent, a time when they were indeed among the mighty ones of old, the men of fame, whereas now are no longer that, anymore, and never will be again, ever. It's interesting to note that these modern-day stories often portray those so-called superheroes as being more concerned with their egos, rather than using their superpowers to rescue the weaker and vulnerable people from injustices and harm, fighting and arguing among themselves, instead of selflessly serving the less fortunate, a rather animal and demonic trait for them to exhibit, intriguingly an archetypal theme, reminiscent of many ancient stories about the mythical pagan gods. It's also interesting that many of these modern-day fictional stories promote the idea that everlasting life would be a curse, instead of a blessing, that human death is to be somehow accepted as part of a natural cycle of life, a rather atheistic Darwinian philosophy, and maybe the demons find some sort of perverted, twisted comfort in thinking those notions that are contrary to biblical teachings. But those fallen angels, Satan and the demons, according to the Bible, are well aware of the fate that eventually awaits them, first to be locked away in an abyss for a time, then released again for one final time, before their total annihilation, eternal non-existence, what the Bible calls the second death, the symbolic lake of fire, where not only Satan and the demons will come to their permanent end, total everlasting destruction as if by fire, but the Bible also specifically points out that even the grave, Hades, will be thrown into this lake of fire, human death will be eradicated, that the meek shall inherit the earth and live forever upon it, once their final judgment is complete, once Satan's miserable experiment on mankind, that God allowed him to do, has served its purpose, so that, after 6,000 years of abject evil, suffering, and death, what will by then have proven to have been an unnecessary outcome had it not been for the issue being raised by Satan, the issue of universal sovereignty will finally be resolved. The idea, the apparent fact, that mere humans will one day come to outlive Satan and the demons, may very well offend these narcissistic spirits. So, even though at that time, human lifespans were above 900 years, God had already made the decision to end the depraved, wicked, and violent world. But why did God decide to use a global flood only once, as a means of destruction, and never again? Logically, not only was genetic contamination of those fallen angels removed from the human race, from the experiment, but also, the flood caused a genetic information bottleneck, because, after the flood you only had the genetic information of 8 people left over in the world, and so by reductionist methodology, has thus brought forward in time the true, inevitable, outcome, in Satan's miserable experiment, and by shortening its duration, has therefore eliminated a lot of unnecessary amounts of suffering that would have otherwise eventuated, for untold thousands, perhaps even millions, of more years long, who can really say, for the human race to reach its current state of degeneration, that has become manifest in the relatively short human lifespans of the 21st century, that is, the people alive now have inherited shorter lifespans, a lot sooner than how it would have been if the flood had not happened. So at a time before the flood, the biblical account tells us that God foretold that the lives of the people at that time would end in another 120 years. And in later times, lifespans have dropped down to an average of 70 to 80 years, because, since the flood, the overall amount of genetic entropy in the human population has increased. Mankind has rapidly degenerated since those days. Some population geneticists now think that this type of genetic decay will eventually result in the extinction of the human race, something that a Darwinist model likely would not predict, but the biblical model does. Of course, those who have habitually viewed the world through an exclusively naturalistic lens might immediately try to think up some alternative, naturalistic, ad hoc ideas to account for this overwhelming empirical evidence that seems to go against their much-loved macroevolution hypothesis, instead of considering the conspicuous plausibility of the biblical account. But it seems that there is always just far more intriguing evidence in favor of the biblical narrative that keeps getting elucidated. And there is a particular line of evidence that is hard to honestly ignore. Perhaps the most intriguing scientific evidence in support of the 900+ years lifespans of humans, degenerating to shorter ones, is when you take those biblically recorded claimed lifespans of those people, stated as being from the time of the flood onward, in the Bible, plot on a graph, both their claimed lifespan and the alleged time period in which they lived. And astoundingly, what you get from this is something like a typical decay curve. It's astounding because it was all supposedly written by different people who lived in different time periods and never knew one another, and it is ridiculous to think that they all conspired to fabricate a lie like this long after their death. It seems far more plausible that they were not lying in this manner. Why would they? Even for the most hardened skeptic, this seems to be incredibly difficult to explain away in any other rational way other than the biblical explanation, and seems to beg profound questions. But couldn't God have miraculously shortened lifespans without the use of a flood? Logically, yes, God can do anything He pleases. But, in that particular hypothetical scenario, imagine what Satan and the other rebellious fallen angels, the demons, would have complained about, and, who knows, also maybe others too. They would have said that it was no longer a proper experiment, because supernatural forces had interfered with the natural consequences of it all, either due to their own genetic interference that would delay divine judgment upon Satan and the demons, or God not letting the natural degeneration of the human race run its inevitable course. But a flood event was a more natural enough way of advancing this horrible experiment, which unfortunately we as humans are all a part of, and so shortening it, and reducing it down, clearly has demonstrated its future final inevitable outcome, the degeneration of mankind. And it has also eliminated unnecessary amounts of suffering, both a lesser number of people and its duration overall. But even more importantly, the global flood event, in effect, reset the experiment back to how it was before Satan and the other fallen angels had interfered with it. It simplified things perhaps to an amount that was somewhat appropriate, most likely reducing many unneeded variables, leaving virtually no room for doubt about what such evidence really proves. For the greater good, it is ultimately able to put to rest, once and for all, the issue of universal sovereignty. It unequivocally shows us the far-reaching implications, that without God, everything, literally everything, is doomed. Humans cannot exist happily forever without God, and they will go extinct. And perhaps the universe will decay away to nothing. The Bible says, about the people who allegedly lived in the time before the global flood occurred, that God looked upon the earth, and it was ruined, all flesh had ruined its way on the earth. It is also plausible that the people of that time might have ruined the earth too quickly and prevented other outcomes and vital lessons. If the earth became uninhabitable at that time, and the human race was wiped out, the sad genetic outcome of the human race would not be as obvious to some, especially humans, more so than superintelligent angels, and perhaps most importantly, it would cut off the prospect of what was then mankind's future savior, the foretold Messiah. It shows us that mankind, no matter how clever he is, ultimately cannot win against the inexorableness of entropy and decay. Some people have difficulty accepting the biblical narrative that we are imperfect, therefore unavoidably sinful, and suffer and die ultimately because of the sins of the first two humans, Adam and Eve, the two people from whom we inherited this suffering. Why should we be suffering the consequences of what someone else did? This is where our emotions could blind us to what is reasonable. When we consider the concept of God, it stands to reason that God knows more about this whole business than we do. Who are we really, to question God's wisdom, if God understands the whole picture better than anyone else? Yes, we are rightfully upset about our situation, but that has no bearing on how to ultimately solve the problem, does it? It seems we must have faith in God, and trust that He knows what is better long-term. But there is no denying the fact that all creation has been groaning and in pain, until now. Many believe that God is the only one who can bring us back from the brink, just like the account of what God did in resurrecting the decaying body of a man called Lazarus. We said at the outset of this discussion that the evolution versus creation controversy, although inclusive of science, is not primarily about science. It's about trying to decide whether either intelligent design or natural evolution provides an ultimate explanation for all creation. It's about two opposing belief systems, two ideas about what, or who, the ultimate creator of existence is, and which idea contains either more or less superstition, seemingly what some people consider to be beyond the reach of scientific investigation. One extraordinary guess is that evolution did it all, and nature created nature, and the other model includes the intelligent design of nature. Actually, the biblical narrative takes this even higher, also giving us one possible explanation for why God would currently allow the observable evil and suffering, and reveals to us that it's an argument about universal sovereignty, about the right to rule, whose right it is to set moral standards. It also implies that the unproven type of Darwinian evolution, specifically the concept of uphill evolution of increasing functional complexity from only unguided natural processes, is a satanic lie, designed to blind people to the reality of God. This idea, that an intelligent creator was never needed for our existence and that existence itself is ultimately pointless, is a myth, propagated by the most maniacal power-hungry homicidal pariah ever, Satan the devil, the ultimate lying slanderer and mass murderer of all time, who has largely misled the world of mankind into believing these lies about our existence, and, over the centuries of time available to him, and while time remains before his inevitable final destruction, to blind the minds of unbelievers and take down as many people as he can, with him, into destruction, and spitefully down through history, through various means he and his demonic hordes have been doing whatever they can, to erase, from the historical memory of humankind, the name of God, Jehovah. This level of evil, if true, is truly astonishing and stupefying. So this is a relatively simple analysis of the biblical model. As it is with secular hypotheses, you can likewise examine the physical evidence that is consistent with its predictions, and also consider any paradoxes that one might infer from it. After telling his disciples about how the particular Jewish system of their time was going to end, and also how the future system of things involving all the nations of the earth is going to end, Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." Some take heaven and earth to be a metaphorical analogy of that Jewish system back then, and also all man-made governments. Others take it more literally. Scientists generally agree that the literal, physical, heaven and earth will eventually pass away. This is what they call the theoretical heat death of the universe due to the second law of thermodynamics. We cannot be dogmatic about it, but some take Jesus' words to mean that he is emphasizing that his prophecy is more dependable, more trustworthy, and more permanent than the ongoing existence of the universe itself. And if true, that would be a very profound statement indeed. It may be reasonable to think that when considering God's foreknowledge of the future world, not only did his prophecy have far-reaching consequences, but also it was meant to be useful for people living in modern times, and perhaps heaven and earth passing away might be understood also in a scientific way. The transitory nature of the physical is contrasted with the permanence of God. In Psalm 102 verses 25 to 27, it says, "Long ago you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. Just like a garment they will all wear out. Just like clothing you will replace them, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years will never end." Atheistic scientists wanted to believe that the universe was eternal, inferring no need for a creator, but the scientific evidence has caused most scientists to discard that idea. It is now generally accepted that the universe has a finite past and future, according to the well-known scientific theories that are based on repeatable, consistent evidence. And in Isaiah chapter 51 verse 6 God says, "Raise your eyes to the heavens, and look at the earth below. For the heavens will disperse in fragments like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants will die like gnats. But my salvation will be eternal, and my righteousness will never fail." Later, Jesus, while on earth, said, "Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came, not to destroy, but to fulfill." Truly I say to you that sooner would heaven and earth pass away than for one smallest letter or one stroke of a letter to pass away from the law until all things take place. Whoever, therefore, breaks one of these least commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in relation to the kingdom of the heavens. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in relation to the kingdom of the heavens. For I say to you that if your righteousness does not surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of the heavens. Well, that is not a very high bar that has been set for us. The scribes and the Pharisees are historically well known for their self-righteous, judgmental attitude toward everybody, and, most notably, their hypocrisy. And after all, today no human is perfect. We are all suffering the ill effects of entropy and decay, the consequence of disobedience, and, primarily, the original sin. Is it any wonder that Jesus said that the load that he would bestow upon us would be light, not burdensome, and that we can find refreshment for our souls? So when viewing the entire situation from the biblical perspective, it makes perfect sense. Jehovah's sweet mercy, his undeserved kindness toward us, brought to us humans through his firstborn of all creation, his master worker, his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, the Savior of all those who would acknowledge the rightfulness of the Creator Jehovah as the universal sovereign and who want to be saved by him and for him. Some may wonder if the miracles described in the Bible can really be believed to have happened because this has never been part of our experience in life. But, whether true or not, does the evidence left over in the world now disagree with it in any definitive way? Can we scientifically discern one way or the other whether it is true or not? Or does it remain an open question? What type of faith is required to believe either way? Well, the entropy principle intrinsic to the second law of thermodynamics points us to a more organized start of every physical thing in existence, so that's a good start to answering the question, don't you think? Whatever the case, committed Darwinian evolutionists want to believe that because there are observable changes in organisms that indeed are naturally selected, they imagine that given enough time and many generations, they will add up to large changes and that such imagined cumulative change will amount to upward improvement. This superstition may have seemed plausible back in the 18th century, but in more recent times such a commitment to this materialist type of Darwinian belief system seems irrational, since according to what science has now discovered about how genetic information works, this idea cannot be correct. The genetic entropy argument suggests that it's not the amount of change that is the issue, but the direction of the change which is indisputable. According to the entropy principle, the change should be downward, in the direction of more disorder, meaning less and less useful genetic information over time, less function, and one day reach the irreducibility limit, and that is what population geneticists are now confirming. It seems that no amount of natural selection could ever stop, nor could have ever stopped, this degenerative process. That is to say, biological evolution is an unstoppable downward process, heading toward an evolutionary dead end. Total extinction. And so in a similar way, it can also be said, for the evolution of the entire physical universe. According to Sanford and other population geneticists, we are seeing more scrambling of the code from one generation to the next, and there will be less and less useful code, until one day there is simply not enough to sustain function and reproduction anymore, and this would mean humanity's extinction. So contrary to what evolutionists believe, when left to nature alone, lots of time does not help the strategy, but instead means the inevitable destruction of everything. So, if your faith is not like a Darwinian evolutionist's faith, a personal incredulity that ignores repeatable testable evidence, but instead your faith is based on proper established scientific principles, then the logical implication of this is, the original first humans, the first intelligently designed man and woman that existed, must have had the most amount of good genetic information, from which the rest of the human race has descended and unfortunately degenerated. It is true that in recent times, human lifespans have increased, but that is due to better medical technology, better sanitation, and scientifically sound health standards, not because the human genome is improving. Human populations are still degenerating, and if all the modern medical treatments were not there, the average human lifespan would still be less than that of previous generations. But what does observational science actually tell us? The empirical data reveals a fundamental truth: when first cousins marry, their children have a reduction of life expectancy of nearly 10 years. Why is this? It is because inbreeding exposes the genetic mistakes within the genome, slightly detrimental recessive mutations, that have not yet had time to come to the surface. Inbreeding is like a sneak preview, or foreshadowing, of where we are going to be genetically as a whole as a species in the future. The reduced life expectancy of inbred children reflects the overall aging of the genome that has accumulated thus far, and reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic damage that have been accumulating in our genomes. Sanford, Genetic Entropy, page 147. So, inbreeding accelerates the degeneration of genomes, including the human genome, by creating a population bottleneck in terms of biological diversity. Many children do not know who one, at least, of their biological parents might be, and potentially, there could have been instances where brothers and sisters unknowingly interbreed, because they did not know that they were brother and sister, and their offspring incur a larger than average amount of exposed genetic detrimental recessive mutations. The atheist Darwinian model would not have much to say about morals, in the context of avoiding sexual promiscuity that has a greater probability of ignorant inbreeding, unintentional incest. The biblical model of early times advocated strict rules on how humans could breed, and advocates honest long-term monogamous permanent relationships for later generations of people during the Christian era, which is a far more scientifically sound standard of behavior according to genetic principles in today's world. The theological perspective seems to contain far more wisdom in this particular case than the atheist worldview. This does not seem to be mere confirmation bias, but to actually contain some substance to the argument after all. The opportune appearance of mutations permitting animals and plants to meet their needs seems hard to believe. Yet the Darwinian theory is even more demanding. A single plant, a single animal would require thousands and thousands of lucky, appropriate events. Thus, miracles would become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal probability could not fail to occur. There is no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it. Pierre P. Gros, past president of the French Académie des Sciences. Lee Spetner says, but in all the reading I've done in the life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not increase it. Lee Spetner, MIT, not by chance. Sanford's book makes another reference. Bergman, 2004, has studied the topic of beneficial mutations. Among other things, he did a simple literature search via biological abstracts in Medline. He found 453,732 mutation hits, but among these only 186 mentioned the word beneficial, about 4 in 10,000. When those 186 references were reviewed, almost all the presumed beneficial mutations were only beneficial in a very narrow sense, but each mutation consistently involved loss of function changes, hence loss of information. So, they are the inconvenient scientific facts, not beliefs. With the macroevolution hypothesis you have at least two main problems. 1. Most mutations are not selectable by nature. These are the Trojan horse of evolution theory, which means they are not immediately noticed and keep accumulating. As for the comparatively incredibly few mutations that can be naturally selected, this simply means either death for the organism before it can reproduce, or survival, if that organism lives and breeds, for remaining genes including the unselectable damaged genes that have lost some of their information, but no new more complex information of any use is created. Which brings us to 2. The fact that the overwhelming majority of mutations are deleterious even if their bad effects are not immediately known, and that any rare beneficial mutations are the result of being damaged and having incurred information loss, resulting in less functional code, therefore means that the logical outcome of this is incontestable. Mother Nature selects mistakes, she selects information loss, for short-term survival, which in the long term can only be bad. Evolutionists are faced with the daunting task of proving that new novel functional information can be created by chance, and such an increase has never been seen happening. It is hard to imagine how anyone having a reasonable degree of discernment, who has properly considered all this evidence, can ever honestly believe that life could ever arise by chance, or that life can ever, naturally, evolve in the direction of increasingly functional, more highly integrated complexities. When considering the combinatorial possibility space in the genetic code of something, it is easy to fool oneself into thinking that you have considered the total picture of improbability. Although the number of possible sequences of base pairs is vast, especially non-functional possibilities, the improbability of getting a functional sequence has not been sufficiently accounted for, even though at this point it is still manifestly astronomical. But you have overlooked the even larger problem of what you failed to consider, that being the system that reads and decodes the code in the various subsystems that use the specified information. The improbability of those systems also arising from chance occurrences in tandem with the code has to be accounted for as well. So, the extraordinary claim that natural selection can climb up the gently sloping back of a mountain improbable does not seem plausible at all. It seems ludicrously superstitious. Even if by some minuscule possibility unknown to science, a new improved more complex section of specified, more complex functional code somehow evolved, and nature was about to select and preserve it for reproduction, there are vastly more degenerative mutations, of which most are the more subtle ones that nature cannot select, regardless of any known possible short-term beneficially degenerative duplication errors that nature might also select, or favor, for the survival of the organism, for reproduction. The inevitable outcome is that for every improbable rare upward step, to the extent that there are any upward steps at all, on the mountain of improbabilities, there are millions and millions of highly probable downward steps that genetic scientists know do in fact exist, and therefore, it appears, overall things devolve, or degrade, over time. Whether such hypothetical genetic improvements are possible or not, this is a statistical mechanical argument that describes an entropic process, that of living populations degenerating. The argument was not religious, but rather, it was scientific. If you can neither prove nor disprove an idea, then whether you believe it or disbelieve it, it is faith, one way, or the other. However, if you find accumulating contradictions in the data against your imagined model but still choose to believe it, then it is highly likely that this might also reveal this type of Darwinism to be an example of deliberate incredulity. Why do we say that? For those who have given serious consideration to the macroevolution hypothesis, to be truly scientific and open to evidence, one must be consistent and also give equal consideration to the genetic entropy phenomena, of which entropic processes are found to be far more logically consistent at a more fundamental level, and has been demonstrated over and over with much scientific testing. On the other hand, the macroevolution hypothesis has proven to be continually in disagreement at similar levels with experiments and observations in the laboratory, at many levels. Genetic entropy, therefore, seems to be more a legitimate theory than the counter-arguing macroevolution hypothesis, since genetic entropy is consistent with empirical tests in the laboratory and other predictions it makes are also correct. It can also be theoretically examined, and in doing so is proving to be fundamentally correct. Additionally, the genetic entropy theory does not need presupposing the cause of similarities in various species or phyla, both living creatures and dead fossils, but can be completely independent of such speculation. This constraint makes it far more scientifically rigorous. Notwithstanding, when choosing this line of inquiry, even when including those speculations, genetic entropy theory is nonetheless in agreement with these things too. Genetic entropy theory provides an answer to some of the more philosophical objections raised against the intelligent creation argument, or when atheists and materialists temporarily abandon their so-called non-religious position and decide to try and debunk certain religious ideas, and advocate their unsubstantiated naturalistic beliefs, in particular those ideas about origins. The bad design argument: if God is perfect in every way, why do we see things in nature that appear badly designed? Things seem badly designed because they either are observed to function badly, or they are malfunctioning and even causing other bad problems. Genetic entropy accounts for this well. If those biological mechanisms worked perfectly and were perfectly maintained, the design would appear efficient for its purpose. But when these mechanisms break down or malfunction, they appear badly designed, because corruption has crept into the system. From this, we might infer that even perfect designs require maintenance. Sometimes a design may appear inefficient, or possible reasons for it may elude us, that is, in certain situations is due to our ignorance. Why God is not currently maintaining such systems is a separate question, and a good one. But that is not a scientific question but more of a religious question to deal with. That being said, the evidence nonetheless agrees with the biblical model as an explanation of the current amount of disorder observable in nature. It becomes apparent how a prior commitment to materialism, that is staying within the philosophy of naturalism, thereby excluding God or the supernatural or superintelligence as a possible explanation, fails to provide an answer at this level of inquiry so far, especially when the science demonstrates that everything is only degenerating, continually having less and less organization and less available energy. But when invalidating such an argument by exclusion, philosophically one possible explanation is found in the Bible, which contends since the first humans disobediently rebelled against their Creator, that the question of universal sovereignty is at stake and we are all part of Satan's miserable experiment, and God is allowing the experiment to run its natural course without interference from Him, in some sense, almost like a kind of deistic God, to show that the existence of God and Him taking action by intervening is necessary for the continuation of eternal order and perfection. Yes, okay, that was a religious question. What about the scientific question of vestigial organs? Evolutionists argue that certain organs that were useful in the past are now useless. This has been sometimes debunked, but even when some examples of this are true, this only provides further confirmation of genetic entropy, in that living things are only losing their functions. They are not gaining functions. For example, blind cavefish. We can identify their relatives, members of the same fish species that live above ground, in rivers of Texas and Mexico, and which have perfect vision. Scientists know that the blindness is a result of genetic mutations, because biologists have found that when hybridizing blind cavefish from different cave populations, they can partially restore the vision of their offspring. Scientists recognize the folly of monoculture in various plant crops. Therefore, they have also built an ark to preserve plant species and to preserve the biodiversity, perhaps also in case of some global, cataclysmic, mass extinction event. This is a tacit recognition of the genetic entropy principle. The seed vault is managed under terms spelled out in a tripartite agreement among the Norwegian government, the Crop Trust, and the Nordic Genetic Resource Center. The notion of junk DNA being the raw material for an imagined upward change for evolution has also been largely debunked, but even if a tiny part of the genetic code was discovered to be useless, this agrees with the genetic entropy logic as an explanation, in that it represents the deterioration of the code. A very small amount of random and useless information in the DNA is the very prediction of the genetic entropy theory. Such predictions have been realized, therefore legitimizing the genetic entropy theory, and in a way that cannot be said for the macroevolution hypothesis. The idea of upward evolution, macroevolution, is in disagreement with it. Darwinists sometimes accuse intelligent design theories of having no practical value in the real world. However, it is difficult to show how Darwinian upward evolution hypotheses have produced any good fruitful scientific discovery that would be of any practical use in the real world that a creationist or intelligent design perspective could not do equally well or even better in this sense. What about the wild Darwinian predictions that superbugs will keep getting more super than before? Maybe this is somewhat a hyperbole, but if this comic book Hollywood X-Men fallacy is accepted by authorities and more money is spent to tackle the idea, it could conceivably turn out to be wrong. If genetic entropy is true and there are only information loss and loss of function that demonstrates adaptations to be limited, and if in the long term degrades an organism, then more money would be directed toward things like better sanitation, preventative measures, better infrastructure, and proper nutrition, instead of giving excessively large amounts of money to multi-billion-dollar drug companies to developing more drugs based on sometimes a mostly false premise. This theoretical understanding is more useful and if acknowledged would prevent a lot of unnecessary expenditure and divert resources to where they would be of much more actual benefit. Unfortunately, we not only have genetic decay to deal with but also moral decay. But that is a different topic for another discussion. Because of the materialist ideology, the burden of proof is often framed as being on the creationists. And certainly, no human at this time has witnessed any sort of divine intervention. Yet the ludicrous improbabilities that Darwinists appeal to make it obvious that logically the burden of proof is more on the Darwinists. The entropy principle is established beyond doubt in mainstream science, by which materialists claim to adhere. So if someone is going to claim that natural selection can somehow overcome or circumvent entropy, then they are required to set out a computational mathematical pathway that can be theoretically investigated at the same fundamental level as the genetic entropy theory, and calculate a logical outcome for experimental testing. But they cannot, and if anything at all, such experiments confirm a law of increasing genetic entropy. For a journalist, not a tabloid journalist, but a serious journalist, facts are said to be the most important thing so that we can shine a light in a dark place. The use of the word fact in such cases needs to be very precise, for if there are any discrepancies, then credibility becomes an issue and is highly questionable. When not specifying which type of evolution is factual, the general impression is that every tenet of the Darwinian theory is being preached as proven fact, both micro and macro, which will then be perceived, by those more knowledgeable, a false equivocation, a bait-and-switch argument, and such arguments are not credible, and in principle, the bad journalism should be made widely known to the less knowledgeable, so that public perception of an issue is corrected. Unfortunately, this very rarely if ever happens, and even when it does happen, usually the correction is not given the same amount of exposure and publicity as the original falsehood. Regarding a website that catalogs retractions of scientific papers, Wikipedia admits, Retraction Watch has demonstrated that retractions are more common than was previously thought. When Retraction Watch was launched, some people wondered if we'd have enough material. It had been estimated that about 80 papers were retracted annually. However, in its first year, the blog reported on approximately 200 retractions. In October 2019, the Retraction Watch database reached 20,000 entries, and as of September 2020 it contains 24,064 items. The general current standards of journalism are manifestly not high enough. Even though the abiogenesis idea and the macroevolution hypothesis have not been demonstrated using tests and observation and currently contradict science-based truth, it should come as no surprise that this has not been a general perception. Those two hypotheses cannot legitimately be called fact when such evidence cannot support those ideas, and even worse, the empirical evidence diametrically opposes such superstitious Darwinian ideas of upward change over time. And yet bad journalism has given many people a false representation. Much inadequately presented documentary movie making has done this also. And this is disgraceful, and many more professional people should call it out for what it really is. When it comes to the quite often unsatisfactory naturalism of the gaps philosophy, some serious scientists now suggest that macroevolution, by this of course we mean hypothetical, generational upward, biological transformations of increasing functional complexity, this idea is not a real gap filler for science at all, not anymore in the quest to determine origins of species, because of observed and measured genomic decay, but nobody has seen the genomes of isolated populations get better, increasing their genetic information and complexity. But conversely, degeneration of species is a proven scientific fact. It seems from the entropy principle, and properly conducted experiments, that this particular gap has been closed altogether, that this naturalistic macroevolution idea has countless times been demonstrably refuted, shown to be empirically false. In fact, lots of degeneration of species, but no regeneration of an isolated population's genome becoming more functionally complex has ever been seen, which would have to happen to make a Darwinian tree of life possible. Even characterizing it as macroevolution of the gaps appears charitable for this evolutionist ideology. It is amazing that it is even taken seriously by anyone in the natural sciences anymore. But, if you are an atheist and that particular hypothesis were not available, what else would you have left to support that position of disbelieving the existence of an intelligent designer of the various life forms in the world? What other tenable explanation is there, other than intelligent design? The tested evidence points us in one direction. From a human standpoint, the entire process is unstoppable and should not be sugar-coated. It is sadly inevitable if left to nature itself. We are not obligated to like this, but it's a scientific fact nonetheless. This continual increase in the scrambling of life specifications means death for the individual cells and then later the entire person, and even much later the outright extinction for the entire human species if left unchecked. This extends even further because in principle this implies that all life forms are heading for eventual extinction. It also implies that this very fundamental problem is way beyond the ability of humans to solve. It's hard to conceive of how all those trillions of lines of code, every letter in every gene and every cell in everybody, could all be tracked, and somehow figure out a way of correcting all the uncountable inevitable individual copying mistakes when necessary, all happening perfectly and immediately at the right time. There is every good logical reason to suspect that science will never find a way of stopping old age, and it will not be able to arrest the continual degradation of the human species and eventual extinction. This reasoning can be extended to how scientists readily accept the eventual heat death of our universe. Entropy implies the existence of God, or at least some type of intelligent creator. Things must have begun more ordered, more organized. Everything physical. That's all there is to it. This is not a dogmatic statement. And if deeply enough considered, it can also be realized that this is not a religious statement either, but a well-founded scientific retrodiction, based on sound theoretical reasoning and empirical data with predicted consequences. All repeatable experience without exception agrees with this notion. It's a testable argument. Genetic entropy theory has never been falsified, although in principle there are many ways in which one can try to falsify it, and where people have, inadvertently perhaps, tried to do it, and it is reasonable to believe with almost absolute certainty that it never will be proven false, although, if the past is anything to go by, there are many people of hubris with big egos that will probably make such grandiose claims, destined to eventually collapse in deepest humiliation, perhaps have it minimized by biased and lazy journalists making minimal retraction, that do not match in scope or scale the originally published ill-conceived and presumptuous claims, thus leaving the majority of the general public misled and uninformed, thereby having disgraced their profession of choice, and leaving people cheated out of the truth. Other arguments can be hand-waved away perhaps. For example, it is said that there is far more archaeological and historical evidence that Jesus Christ was a real person than what there is for William Shakespeare or Julius Caesar. You might choose to dismiss it. Those anecdotes are interesting and compelling, but not definitive enough for certain skeptics. On the other hand, the entropy principle is definitive. It can be examined mathematically and empirically. There is no getting around its consistency or its absolute truth. Many atheistic evolutionists continually try to get around it and fail, but unfortunately, in doing so, many unsuspecting people are misinformed as a result, and this is catastrophic for general public awareness, and for people's ability to weigh up the reasons for having a sense of hope for a better future reality, in regard to theological implications. It is somewhat amusing that Darwinists and materialists try to circumvent the entropy law, because we are fairly certain scientifically that the universe does not have the available amount of probabilistic resources to accommodate the ludicrous improbabilities required to make the natural change, anywhere in the universe, go the opposite way, even momentarily. How anyone could think it possible that all the uncountable numbers of particles of any system known would all suddenly reverse their different trajectories, with absolute perfection, as if it were in a movie film run backward, is obviously ridiculous. So, how can anyone, who has given this problem the appropriate attention, believe that enough genetic mutations will be lucky improvements for natural selection to preserve? Doesn't it seem to have almost the same level of absurdity? And we know that most, if not all, of those genetic mutations will never reverse to their previous state, and most of them will degenerate the code each time they mutate. We have seen the effects of this in small isolated populations of organisms getting sicker and sicker due to inbreeding. So the predicted consequences of this declaration are correct. This likely indicates that modern atheism and the Darwinian belief system upon which it is reliant are both untenable, indefensible, unreasonable, in many cases, manifestly anti-scientific, and therefore superstitious. Humanism, despite its atrocities, may have had some short-term gains, but it is, ultimately, destined to fail, just like those beneficial mutations that evolutionists appeal to. It would seem that nothing short of a miracle will save the human race. There is no scientifically proven reason why biological systems should not degenerate just like all other things in the universe that are left to themselves and not maintained. In Darwin's lifetime, similarities were seen, by some people, to be observable evidence for unplanned upward evolution, but with the discovery of DNA code, this is no longer adequate from a scientific perspective. The genetic entropy theory with its predictions highlights how the God of the gaps objection in the wrong context can become an argument by exclusion. Just like in archaeology, you'll have an impossible time if you cannot posit intelligent design as a possibility, and you are only allowed to explain it with natural causes. Try explaining the existence of the pyramids in Egypt using only random unguided natural processes, if you can. And so with physics and biology, you'll have a very difficult time, perhaps an impossible time, in trying to explain how ultimately all things, including genetic mutations, are only observed degenerating and not observed evolving upward. Moreover, it all points to an organized beginning of everything. The ad hoc hypothesis of things evolving upward in the past only, and not in the present, is not adequately falsifiable, therefore not sufficiently testable, and it seems ridiculous from a rational perspective. Why only in the past? Why do we never observe naturally occurring unguided non-informational upward development somewhere in the present as well? Things do not undecay. When weighing up the balance of total evidence, what do we find? Other than some similarities between different novel body plans and various DNA codes, it is hard to think of an adequate enough way of affirming the macroevolution belief system. If this exclusively naturalistic ideology deliberately chooses not to distinguish whether such evidence represents common descent or common design principles, then scientifically you are completely adrift, without the intelligent design perspective, because all you have stubbornly allowed yourself is your preconceived ideology of what similarities might imply, naturalistically only, which can provide nothing to anchor it in place, only relativistic with no distinguishable frame of reference. It appears the intelligent design perspective seems to provide the only possible distinctive explanation that can account for much of the testable experimental evidence that is observed. The one-way direction of change in nature, that is to say, the proven laws of physics have a level of disagreement if constrained to an exclusively naturalistic worldview, but are in full agreement only when including the intelligent design of nature, within the worldview, to account for how everything that has an observable beginning only begins existing in a more functionally complex state, and then perhaps distinguish whether that is true of all physical things, including the entire universe, and the origin of lifeforms possessing distinctive body plans. The Darwinist ideology attempts to claim to be scientific but is demonstrably credulous. Materialist atheists want to believe everything started out simple, without God being needed as an explanation, and then somehow became more complex and functional by themselves. It appears highly implausible that you can naturally go from quantum fluctuations up to humans, no matter how large the possibility space. Experimental science repeatedly and without exception shows us that things in the universe do not go from simplicity to more functional complexity by themselves, but they started more complex and, without pre-existing information or intelligent guidance, things will gradually lose differences and degrade over time. And this implies that intelligent design is more plausibly true by repeatable evidence. Therefore, one particular form of atheism is an anti-scientific religious ideology, a superstitious form of naturalism, and even though both opposing ideas, creationism and evolutionism, are somewhat religious, nonetheless, belief in the existence of Almighty God as the ultimate creator is more scientifically compatible. How could everything have started more ordered and functional in the beginning without intelligent design, without the existence of something like the biblical eternal Almighty God Jehovah? At the very least, science has repeatedly experimentally demonstrated such a process is manifestly impossible without intelligent causation. Life is not meaningless and we are not without hope. Emotions have very little to do with this argument, but logic has more to do with it. If you are not allowed to think this way, then your science is somewhat crippled. The protons in our universe might not observably decay, but there is no empirical reason to believe that life's genetic code doesn't decay, via the reproductive and reiterative processes built into it. All the evidence points toward the logical outcome that specified complex genetic code is heading toward becoming Shannon information, that is to say, informational entropy, which is the situation of it all being pure random non-functional informational bits, in that it is completely scrambled and meaningless and therefore useless for sustaining life processes, although life itself will shut down a lot sooner than that, because of its irreducibly complex functionality, if things were allowed to continue that far. That's the tipping point, where the decay curve ends. Other arguments that further extrapolate above and beyond such are outside the scope of science. Any discussion of who or what the intelligent designer is creates a set of questions that probably go outside of nature and are extra-scientific, philosophical, and probably religious. So the scientific discussion ends here, and the religious discussion begins somewhere else, which includes things like who God is, morals and ethics, etc. The arguments for morals and ethics are ironically self-evident, which is interesting for those who insist on logic and rationality. So, how do you define the word evolution? If you advocate that naturally caused, upward, evolution is a proven fact, then there is only one thing left to be said: get out of the science room. You don't belong in there, because you are promoting a superstitious belief system, a type of secular ideology of many atheists, which has already been debunked by the operational scientific method of reproducible experiment and observation. Leave, in disgrace and deepest humiliation. Leave now. On the other hand, if you advocate that natural evolution is only a downward process, and if you are not emotional, but logical, rational, and objective instead, and therefore you accept the empirical evidence from repeatable experiments, which shows us that everything observable begins their existences in a more organized functional condition, including all lifeforms, then, welcome to the world of true science. You belong in the science room. Well done. And maybe when you are outside the science room, and possibly sometimes inside the science room as well, you have a very strong scientific reason to believe in the existence of God. And perhaps not just any God, but the biblical Judeo-Christian Almighty God, Jehovah.